For most of the world, the year 2000 was an exciting and seemingly transformational moment. The 1990s had been a decade of optimism and hope. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the human species exhaled a collective sigh of relief that civilization had survived the danger of nuclear Armageddon. To many in the West, the end of the Cold War was more than just the passing of existential fear, or even the emergence of a unipolar moment, a period where the United States dominated the international system. It was, as Francis Fukuyama so eloquently put it, the end of history, a time where human civilization and society had supposedly attained its final and perfect form of political governance, liberal democracy. The geopolitical ascendancy of the West and the universal adoption of liberal values seemed inexorable, and with the turning of the millennium, the world now looked towards a more positive century, defined by the principles of universal human rights, democracy, and prosperity. But despite the collective confidence of the Western powers, this utopian vision of the 21st century was not held by all. It certainly was not a popular worldview in Kandahar. The 1990s had also been a critical decade in the development of international Salafi jihadism. Almost without exception, the modern international jihadist movement has its roots in the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Throughout the decade-long conflict, thousands of Muslims travelled to Afghanistan to face the great enemy, the atheistic Soviet Union, where they were, ironically enough, often trained and funded by the United States and other Western powers. Despite its gargantuan mass and fearsome warfighting capability, the mighty Soviet army was slowly bled white in the barren mountains of Afghanistan, and by 1989, Moscow had finally decided that supporting the communist government in Kabul was simply not worth the cost. For the Mujahideen, the war drew fighters from all across the Islamic world, and the challenge of training, moving, arming, and financing these men drove the development of increasingly sophisticated jihadist organizations. One of the most prominent and effective was Maktab al-Qadamat, otherwise known as the Afghan Arab Bureau, or Afghan Services Bureau, a group which was founded by several prominent figures within the international Salafist jihadi movement. These included Osama bin Laden, Abdullah Azzam, and Amayan al-Azawahiri. With the aid of their Western allies, Maktab al-Qadamat secretly funneled millions of dollars to fund the Afghan war effort. By the end of the conflict, they had developed a highly sophisticated global financial organization, which raised very serious funds from not only the Islamic world, but the Muslim diaspora across the West. This wealth, much of which had come from bin Laden's Saudi connections, made Maktab al-Qadamat one of the most prominent Mujahideen organizations in Afghanistan and the world. For the global revolutionary Salafist movement, the 1990s had also been a decade of optimism. With the defeat of the Soviet Union and the ascendancy of the Taliban in the Second Afghan Civil War, not only had victory been achieved in Afghanistan, but global jihad now had a safe haven, a full-blown nation-state ruled by a friendly government. Throughout the late 1990s, Kandahar was the mecca of global jihadism. Many young aspiring Mujahideen came to the city looking to make connections and join one of the plethora of militant organizations which had sprouted since the Afghan War. Even before the murderous attacks on 9/11 catapulted him to global infamy, Osama bin Laden was something of a superstar within the revolutionary Salafist community. The son of Saudi billionaire Mohammed bin Laden, Osama was well-educated, highly intelligent, religiously sophisticated, and eloquent, traits that impressed his revolutionary comrades. But most importantly, bin Laden was very well connected. With the assassination of Abdullah Azzam in 1989, the Afghan Services Bureau and its global financial and recruitment architecture was now directly under bin Laden's operational control. In fact, this highly capable network, one which had been so effective during the war with the Soviets, formed the foundation of the newly established Al-Qaeda, or the base. By the year 2000, Osama bin Laden not only had access to millions of dollars and hundreds of recruits, both of which were generated by a clandestine network that stretched across the globe, but stood at the head of the most sophisticated and capable Salafist jihadi organization in the world. This superstar status made bin Laden a highly desirable commodity. Jihadis from across the Islamic world traveled to Kandahar with the hopes of meeting him, aiming to either join his organization or to leverage his financial resources and recruitment network. Not all were granted the opportunity. But in the year 2000, one such meeting took place, and although no one knew it at the time, this was a historical event that would have truly tectonic consequences for both the war in Iraq and the wider Middle East. A Jordanian man of Palestinian descent named Ahmad Fadil al-Nazal al-Khalili arrived in Kandahar seeking an audience with bin Laden. He would later become far better known by his war name, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a moniker which came from his hometown, Zarqa. Zarqawi did not impress bin Laden. Unlike the highly educated and sophisticated elites bin Laden was more accustomed to, Zarqawi was a street thug. Born into a life of abject poverty, a dire socio-economic situation made worse by the early death of his father, Zarqawi's youth had been dominated by anger, rebellion, and crime. At the age of 18, he dropped out of high school and joined a local gang which terrorized his working-class neighborhood. During this period in his life, Zarqawi spent his days drinking and fighting. He was soon arrested and charged with drug possession and sexual assault. As is so often the case, it is in prison that the seemingly disparate worlds of criminality and extremism intertwine, and it was in his first prison term that Zarqawi was indoctrinated and radicalized. Through Salafi jihad, the lost soul found both meaning and purpose, not to mention a kind of socio-cultural status that could not be gained by a mere street criminal. Enthralled by the epic tales of the Mujahideen, and now firmly indoctrinated with a radical Islamist worldview, upon his release, Zarqawi began to frequent the Al-Hussein Ben Ali Mosque, a hotbed of radicalism located on the outskirts of Zarqa. There he was quickly recruited by representatives of the Afghan Services Bureau, and by 1989, Zarqawi found himself in Afghanistan. However, much to his disappointment, when he arrived he found the war was largely over. Now without a purpose, the young Jordanian decided to move to Peshawar, Pakistan, a safe haven for many Arab Mujahideen. Whilst he was living here, Zarqawi met Abu Abdullah al-Mujahir and Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, critical ideological and religious figures who deeply influenced Zarqawi's beliefs, especially concerning the use of violence, ideas that would dominate the organization he would later lead. Al-Maqdisi was also a Jordanian of Palestinian descent, and he and Zarqawi formed a deep and long friendship. In 1993, the two men travelled to Jordan with the aim of destabilizing the government. They established a new jihadist organization called Bayat al-Imam, but just 12 months later this cell was discovered by Jordanian intelligence and both men were arrested. This time, Zarqawi was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. Jordanian prisons are not known to be progressive and humanitarian institutions, and Zarqawi's hellacious experience there shaped him into what he would later become. He endured 8 months of solitary confinement, locked into a cell about the size of a dog kennel, where he spent a brutally hot Jordanian summer. Zarqawi took to the rigors of prison life. He exercised obsessively, using buckets filled with rocks as weights, and within a few years he had transcended his small and slight frame to become a truly imposing physical figure. It was in this simple yet hard life of discipline and routine that Zarqawi fell deeper into extremism. He studied the Quran obsessively, often staying up all night trying to memorize its verses, reciting over 10 at a time to his cellmate. During his criminal life, Zarqawi had accumulated numerous tattoos, and as an act of purification and transformation, he physically removed some of these with a razor blade. By 1999, Zarqawi's combination of fanatical discipline, physicality, and a fondness for violence propelled him to a position of leadership within the prison. He was also beginning to establish a reputation within the Salafi jihadist community as a leader of sorts, a position he gained through example rather than oratory or sophisticated religious argument, his impassioned defense at trial notwithstanding. On March 23, 1999, along with many other jihadis, Zarqawi's sentence was commuted by a royal pardon. He did not remain in Jordan for long, however. Despite its hardship, friends remembered that Zarqawi seemed to miss the simplicity of prison life. He quickly became bored with the tedium of the free world. Within months he had departed Jordan, bound for Chechnya, where the Second Chechen War had just erupted. But he never made it to Russia. Hoping to reconnect with members of the Afghan Services Bureau, Zarqawi returned to Pakistan. But after being arrested in Jalalabad for an expired visa, he reluctantly fled to Afghanistan. His plans once again frustrated, Zarqawi travelled to Kandahar with hopes of meeting bin Laden. Despite how unsuccessful his first decade as a jihadi operative had been, through his imprisonment, Zarqawi had established enough of a reputation with al-Qaeda that he was granted an audience with the de facto Saudi prince. Although accounts of this meeting vary, all agree that the two men did not see eye to eye. Zarqawi's laconic speech was not the kind of conversation the highly educated, erudite, and sophisticated bin Laden was accustomed to. His inner circle typically consisted of religious scholars and college graduates. Indeed, the two men could not have been more different. The son of a Saudi billionaire and the working-class Palestinian-Jordanian street thug was not an easy or a natural fit. But over and above these personal differences, when it came to the overarching grand strategy that should be pursued by global jihad, the two men also sharply disagreed. Bin Laden's entire focus was on the far enemy, the United States. For him, Salafi jihadism was a pan-Islamist, anti-imperial revolutionary movement, one that aimed to establish a caliphate across the entire Muslim world. In order for this grand vision to be achieved, the United States, the power who backed the Arab regimes bin Laden wished to overthrow, had to be the primary focus. If Washington withdrew its support for the numerous royal houses of the Middle East, then the dream of the caliphate could be realized. Zarqawi, however, disagreed. His version of jihad was much more one of a grassroots revolutionary insurgency. Rather than striking the Americans with sophisticated and complex mass casualty terrorist attacks, Zarqawi believed that by focusing on the target regimes themselves and waging an insurgency there, operations much more in the model of the Provisional Irish Republican Army or Tamil Tigers, that these regimes could be overthrown directly. But it wasn't just in the area of grand strategy that the views of the two men diverged. Zarqawi was no pan-Islamist. In truth, his beliefs were far more sectarian than bin Laden. To him, the Shia were practically as much an enemy to be purged as the Western infidels. He argued for a much more violent form of jihad, one that took aim at not just the Western imperialist, but their sectarian enemies as well. Despite these differences and difficulties, it was clear to bin Laden that both men were as committed to the cause of global jihad as each other. Zarqawi was granted permission and funding to form his own organization inside Afghanistan. With bin Laden's blessing, he established a training camp at Herat, near the Iranian border. Zarqawi's experience in prison had shaped him into a leader, especially his fierce devotion and discipline, and within months he became viewed as one of the principal figures amongst the Palestinians and Jordanians in Afghanistan. By 2001, there were 80 men and their families living and training in the Herat military camp, the most prominent of which were Abu al-Qassam, Khalid al-Aruri, and Abd al-Hadi Douglas. These figures would form the nucleus of Zarqawi's organization. Through his reputation amongst other Palestinians, Zarqawi was also able to build connections throughout the numerous al-Qaeda camps in the area, increasing his reach and influence. In the months before 9/11, he was once again summoned to meet bin Laden. Zarqawi's success at Herat had not gone unnoticed, and at this meeting he was asked to formally join al-Qaeda. To everyone's surprise, Zarqawi refused. This may have been an act of audacity, considering just how minor of a player Zarqawi was at the time, but to those who knew him, this was hardly out of character. To his core, Zarqawi was a true believer, a zealot who was utterly sure of his convictions. He had a different view of jihad which he wanted to pursue. Despite the arrogance of this refusal, Zarqawi remained in bin Laden's good graces and continued to receive his funding and support. In truth, Zarqawi's organization was one of many al-Qaeda affiliates who were not operating within the formal command structure, but still leveraged bin Laden's financial network. The wisdom of attacking the United States had been questioned by many. Despite the spectacular success of the terrorist attacks on 9/11, with 3 of the 4 targets effectively hit and thousands of people killed, Washington's retribution was far more swift and devastating than any had imagined. Within weeks of bin Laden's operation, Afghanistan was in chaos. The Taliban had never completely won the civil war. A collection of warlords called the Northern Alliance was holding an enclave in the north of the country. By October 7, 2001, US Special Forces had been inserted into Afghanistan and were working alongside the Taliban's enemies. The combination of air power, special forces, and local proxies proved to be too much for the Taliban. Despite their persistence and penchant for unconventional warfare and insurgency, in truth, the Taliban were no match for the US military in a conventional battle. Their forces melted in the face of devastating air power, and within weeks, the Northern Alliance was on the offensive. For the numerous jihadi camps and organizations in Afghanistan, it was clear that their time in the country was limited. All desperately ran for the Pakistani or Iranian border. In fact, the hasty and disorderly withdrawal underlines just how badly bin Laden and the other jihadis had underestimated the Americans. None of these organizations had advanced evacuation plans in place. Clearly, they had not expected such a rapid and effective Western offensive. Zarqawi's organization was caught just as flat-footed as al-Qaeda. In early November, a month into the US invasion, all of Zarqawi's men packed their families, weapons and belongings into whatever vehicles they could find, and fled the Herat training camp. They were headed for the Pakistani border. Throughout the 3-day journey, the convoy came under constant air bombardment and had to evade the rapidly advancing Northern Alliance forces. Eventually, they reached the Tora Bora area, making contact with the other Mujahideen which had concentrated there. Zarqawi took part in the Battle of Tora Bora, and much like bin Laden, he was lucky to escape alive. By January 2002, just 3 months after 9/11, the flourishing jihadist community that had concentrated in Afghanistan had scattered in the wind. Bin Laden and the other leadership of al-Qaeda retreated into the friendly tribal areas of Pakistan, where in many ways Islamabad's rule was in name alone. The federally administrated tribal areas would be a largely unknown but central theatre of the global war on terror for the next 2 decades, where the Pakistani military fought a decade-long civil war with the Pakistani Taliban and their jihadi allies. The independent-minded Zarqawi, however, had other plans. Despite how he would spend the rest of his life, Zarqawi never shared bin Laden's obsession with the United States. His objectives were far more parochial. He wished to begin an insurgency in Jordan and had been preparing a largely Jordanian and Palestinian force to wage that campaign. Thus, the Pakistani tribal areas were never a realistic option for Zarqawi. But terrorist organizations need infrastructure to effectively operate, and thus he had to find a new home. Through connections he had made at Herat with the Kurdish Islamist organization Ansar al-Islam, Zarqawi decided to move his operation into the Kurdish areas of Iraq, another semi-independent region with relatively limited governmental control. Once he had established a number of training camps in these mountainous and remote areas, it became clear that Washington was planning to invade Iraq. Thus, with the opportunity now falling into his lap, Zarqawi shifted his focus to the coming war with the Americans. In mid-2002, Kurdish authorities became aware of his presence and notified American intelligence. The CIA had never even heard of Zarqawi, and in truth he was nothing more than a minor figure within the Salafi jihadist movement. However, his presence in Iraq was an ideal political opportunity. By this time, the Bush administration was doing everything it could to build international support for the invasion of Iraq, a US policy objective the neoconservative movement had been advancing for a decade. But their case was certainly weak. Over and above the odious nature of the Baathist regime and the unquestionable malevolence of Saddam Hussein, which commentators like Wolfowitz argued was reason enough, the justification of the US-led invasion of Iraq rested on 2 pillars. Firstly, given the threat now posed by global jihadist terrorism, the well-documented Iraqi weapons of mass destruction program posed a nearly existential risk to the United States. If these biological and chemical weapons made it into the hands of al-Qaeda and their affiliates, the delivery of these agents to American population centers could be nearly impossible to stop. The second pillar, which was in actuality a greater support of the first, was the allegation that there were significant links between al-Qaeda and Baathist Iraq. On February 5, 2003, Colin Powell pleaded Washington's case before the United Nations Security Council. The speech, which had actually been prepared by the Vice President's office, presented the assessments of the US intelligence community on both Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program and the presence of jihadist organizations within its borders. To Zarqawi's surprise, Powell named him and his organization as the key al-Qaeda presence in Iraq, which he claimed was being harbored by Saddam's regime. In reality, the links between Zarqawi and Saddam proved to be as nebulous as Iraq's WMD program. Saddam had no, or at least limited, knowledge of Zarqawi's presence within Iraqi Kurdistan, an area where Baghdad only exerted limited control. In truth, the Salafi jihadist organizations like al-Qaeda posed almost as much of a threat to Saddam as they did to Washington. After all, overthrowing the secular Arab regimes was the core geopolitical objective of al-Qaeda and its affiliates. War with the United States was simply a means to that end. Not only were there essentially no links between Zarqawi and Baghdad, at that time he was leading an independent organization with only limited links to bin Laden, the awkwardly named Jamaat al-Tawhid wal Jihad, or the universalities of monotheism and jihad. Despite just how wrong Powell was, his portrayal of Zarqawi as the major Islamist threat in Iraq proved to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Not only did this elevate the relatively unknown Zarqawi's profile amongst the jihadist community, both within Iraq and globally, but this position of de facto local leadership was only becoming more and more important with the disappearance of bin Laden and the looming US invasion. Additionally, it gave Zarqawi ample time to prepare for the coming conflict. On the eve of the invasion, Zarqawi left a childhood friend in charge of his camps in Kurdistan and moved to Baghdad. He had experienced the awesome firepower of the US military firsthand in Afghanistan, and thus had no appetite to fight to defend the Baathist regime he loathed. Instead, he aimed to wage a long war, and began expanding his base of support within the friendly Sunni areas of northwest Iraq, an area which would be the heart of the Iraqi insurgency for years. As American tanks rolled through the streets of downtown Baghdad, Zarqawi simply stood by and watched. On April 2nd, just as the 3rd Infantry Division was in the process of seizing critical points in Baghdad, the 5th Corps commander, Lieutenant General William Wallace, called Coalition Forces Land Component Command Operations Chief Major General James Thurman for instructions. "Okay, Bubba, we're here. Now what?" For many within US military command at the time, Wallace's question was paradigmatic of the listless state which befell coalition forces during the weeks and months following the fall of Saddam's regime. The invasion had been a remarkable success. In just 3 weeks, a force of less than 200,000 personnel, essentially 5 overstrength divisions and special forces, had invaded Iraq and smashed the Iraqi military, which, when paramilitary and other security forces are included, had a strength of nearly 500,000. In terms of a conventional military conflict, Operation Iraqi Freedom had proven to be one of the most successful campaigns in modern military history. But in the fruits of this success laid the seeds of very serious future failure. US forces across the branches struggled to adapt to the rapidly evolving situation. Like General Wallace, many coalition commanders struggled with the transition from high-intensity combat operations to stabilization. A major flaw in the campaign plan developed by CENTCOM was the comparatively little attention paid to Phase 4 of Operation Iraqi Freedom, post-regime stabilization. The invasion itself had been meticulously planned and expertly executed, but the planning for the transition to stabilization operations had not even been completed when the regime collapsed. In the months before the invasion, the US Army and Marine Corps headquarters had focused most of their attention on the immediate tasks of destroying the Iraqi military and imposing regime change. Most assumed that planning for the post-conflict phase would be some other agency's responsibility. This tendency was not helped by the very optimistic assessment that the Iraqi population would welcome the coalition as liberators, also a widespread belief amongst US political leadership. Generally speaking, coalition ground forces expected to maneuver into position, initiate operations, seize their objectives, and then begin redeployment out of the theatre. Little did they know that their war was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The fact that major combat operations ended before planning for Phase 4 of the campaign had been completed meant that this plan had to be implemented whilst it was being developed. This led to a very rough, rolling transition from conventional combat to the stabilization mission. Not only was the lack of planning a real challenge for coalition commanders, but they faced several very significant problems in moving to this more challenging operation. The first was the lack of resources. The technological, doctrinal, and qualitative dominance possessed by coalition forces, especially in the areas of aerospace power and ISR, the foundational elements of the revolution in military affairs, had enabled this meager force to eviscerate the Iraqi military. However, in the stabilization mission, these advantages were far less useful. Iraq is a very large place, and after the capture of Baghdad, significant combat operations were ongoing in the northwest of the country. The border with Jordan and Syria remained wide open, allowing Baathist elements to sink sanctuary and foreign fighters to freely enter Iraq. Although these forces were now acting without centralized command and control, there were also still significant pockets of active resistance in the Sunni triangle, and most of the major cities in the north, such as Mosul and Kirkuk, had not been secured by any coalition forces, although Kurdish Peshmerga and Badr Corps militias had taken some important government buildings in these areas. But the most difficult challenge was the provision of basic security. All across Iraq, gangs roamed the streets, looting and pillaging. Baghdad had descended into chaos. Hospitals, government buildings, Baath Party headquarters, and even museums were all ransacked. Typically, preventing this disorder would be the role of the Iraqi police, but it was a severely dysfunctional organization. Many police officers had deserted, and much of its infrastructure had been destroyed. There were simply not enough coalition formations to provide security for a country of 27 million people. In Baghdad specifically, the local police were able to begin regular patrols with the direct support of the US military, which did eventually bring some semblance of order back to the city. Despite these challenges, coalition forces moved quickly to eliminate the remnants of the Iraqi military, which were still operational. From April 9 to 11, 5th Corps and the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force moved beyond Baghdad, securing ground lines of communication, major population centres and critical infrastructure. The 101st Airborne Division secured the Karbala area, including Najaf, before clearing Hilla. The 82nd Airborne moved to clear Samawa, whilst Task Force Tarawa, essentially the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade, moved to secure the eastern flank, taking Diwania, Numania, and the highways leading into Kut, before advancing east towards Maysan. The remainder of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force advanced northwest. They crossed the Diyala River northeast of Baghdad on April 9 and prepared to secure areas near Saddam's home in Saladin province. Between April 13 and 15, the Marines attacked Baquba and Tikrit before securing Bajil, Samarra, and the highways leading from those cities into Baghdad. They then prepared to secure the remainder of Saladin province before the arrival of the 4th Infantry Division, which was redeploying to Kuwait by sea after its northern invasion route was closed by the Turkish government. In the south, the British 1st Armoured Division moved beyond Basra, securing the strategically vital Rumaila oil fields, and by the 11th were actively patrolling through both Basra and Zubair. During this period, coalition ground units met sporadic resistance, primarily from paramilitary forces such as the Fedayeen Saddam. Despite their exuberance, these attacks were easily beaten back. The typical assault of technical vehicles, civilian flatbed trucks with makeshift heavy weapon mounts attached, were easily broken up by the ever-present menace of Allied air power. Most of the remaining combat with Iraqi regulars was still ongoing in the north, where Colonel Charles Cleveland's Combined Joint Operations Task Force North fought remnants of several Iraqi Army and Republican Guard divisions, primarily the 1st and 2nd Corps. These units had been ravaged by desertion, and Cleveland estimated their strength to be at approximately 40%. With the arrival of heavy forces from Baghdad, these units collapsed. In the massive desert wilderness of western Iraq, Combined Joint Operations Task Force West struggled to close the western border by establishing checkpoints on the major crossings into Syria and Jordan, through which many of the most prominent Baathists had already fled. Finally, several Special Forces elements, including the Rangers and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, shifted from engaging the Iraqi military to hunting high-value targets. As coalition forces spread out and began patrolling through the towns and villages of Iraq, they were shocked by the amount of weaponry they encountered. Baathist Iraq was an extremely militarized society. The Iraqi army had once been the 4th largest in the world. Thus, within its borders, millions of small arms and hundreds of thousands of heavy weapons, artillery pieces, and vehicles remained unaccounted for. Prior to the invasion, the Iraqis had dispersed both their forces and their logistics network, hoping to counter the scourge of Allied air power. Rightly thinking that once the war had commenced, moving large amounts of materiel by road would be impossible, the Iraqi military had dispersed its vast stockpile of munitions and weapons. All across the country, caches of weapons and ammunition had been established, and with the collapse of Saddam's regime, these had simply been abandoned. As an example, when the 4th Infantry Division finally deployed to Tajil Airport, they had to secure hundreds of bunkers full of weapons and ammunition. Often, fully working and armed tanks and infantry fighting vehicles had simply been abandoned. Many were sitting idle on the side of the road. Coalition commanders were shocked by the sheer scale of the problem. Even with a concerted effort to locate and secure as many caches as possible, it was clear to Coalition Forces Command that Iraq was simply awash with weapons and ammunition. Anyone who wished to arm themselves with military-grade weapons had an easy means to do so, and thus, if an insurgency were to take hold, it would not require substantial external supply and logistical support to sustain itself. But the weapons were not the only problem. Almost immediately after the fall of Saddam, new actors began to operate within the battle space. With the defeat of the Iraqi military in the north, the first challenge facing Colonel Cleveland's Special Forces Detachment was averting another Kurdish civil war. The two major Kurdish Peshmerga groups, the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, had a long and violent rivalry. The Americans were working overtime to prevent these forces from engaging one another. Additionally, both were advancing into Arab areas of Iraq such as Mosul and Kirkuk, an action which was likely to precipitate Kurdish reprisals on the local population and stimulate the formation of Sunni militia groups. In order to prevent the outbreak of violence in these areas, it was critical that an American military presence was rapidly established, but the lone 173rd Airborne Brigade had a lot of ground to cover. The Turks had been exerting a clandestine military presence in northern Iraq. Ankara was clearly concerned by the potential emergence of an independent Kurdistan, and the prospect of serious conflict between the Peshmerga and Turkish proxies, or even the Turkish military itself, was a very real one. Cleveland also had major armed adversaries in his area of operations. The Mujahideen-e-Khalq was an Iraqi armed Iranian opposition group which had been sponsored by Saddam. Although it had not defended the regime during the invasion, this organization was still heavily armed and fully intact. Cleveland had no orders describing how this group should be treated if it did not fight. He decided that as long as they were not putting up resistance, they would be given an amnesty, but these forces remained intact and armed. Yet another problem was the Iranian-backed Badr Corps, which had been observed infiltrating into northern Iraq. US command was concerned that these forces were aiming to provoke Mujahideen-e-Khalq and disrupt the ceasefire. These units had to be directly warned that they would be engaged by the coalition if they continued to cross. Despite the rapid victory over Saddam's forces and the presence of friendly Peshmerga, Cleveland found himself standing in the middle of an ethnic tinderbox, and coalition command was already hard-pressed, preventing the region from spiraling into civil war. Now, with the transition to Phase 4 combat operations well underway, Generals McKinnon, Wallace, and Conway, the commanders of the 3rd Army, 5th Corps, and 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, respectively, met to discuss how to best position their forces to stabilize Iraq. The fact that they had to have this meeting at all is crystalline evidence of just how incomplete post-invasion planning had been within CENTCOM and the Pentagon. General McKinnon was surprised by the challenges he was now facing. He simply did not have enough resources. The army was now operating with 2.5 less divisions than the Eclipse II plan had envisaged at this point in the campaign. Because the invasion happened so quickly, and Saddam's regime had fallen so rapidly, there had not been sufficient time to deploy the 4th Infantry Division, 1st Armoured Division, 3rd Armoured Cavalry Regiment, 416th Engineer Brigade, and 352nd Civil Affairs Command. All were still deploying into country. Worse, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld had just cancelled the deployment of the 1st Cavalry Division. Rumsfeld had always been a strong believer in the revolution in military affairs. In his advocacy for the invasion, the Secretary had persistently argued that US strategic objectives could be achieved in Iraq with a very small physical footprint. Thus, all throughout both the planning for the invasion and the stabilization of Iraq, he continuously pressured the Pentagon to limit the deployment of US forces. This meddling and micromanagement even extended into unit deployment. As April came to its close, McKinnon was dumbfounded by the news that the full division he was expecting was simply not arriving. Although McKinnon and the other commanders on the ground did not know it at the time, another battle was being fought in Washington. All of the senior army leadership were desperate to increase troop numbers on the ground. In late April, Pentagon planners in Combined Joint Task Force 7 did a formal troop-to-task analysis, which concluded that the coalition required a total force strength of 300,000 personnel, roughly double the total at the time. But with the unanticipated success of the invasion, both Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, began to air significant reservations on the need to deploy 2 follow-on divisions. Displaying a profound level of ignorance for an individual who purported to be a significant voice within the wider strategic community, in one meeting, Wolfowitz said, "I don't see why it would take more troops to occupy the country than to take down the regime." Over most of April, the generals fought a running battle with Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz over the fate of the 1st Armoured and 1st Cavalry Divisions. When it became clear they were losing, Wolfowitz was becoming more vocal that both divisions should not be deployed, an argument that was gaining ground with Rumsfeld. Fearing the loss of both formations, the chiefs decided to cut their losses and agreed to retain the 1st Cavalry Division in the continental United States as a strategic reserve. This unexpected reduction in resources occurred at a time where the Third Army was desperately trying to secure a heavily armed country with forces that were already inadequate. Additionally, the Marines were about to redeploy out of the theatre, leaving the thinly stretched army divisions with even more ground to cover. When he gave McKinnon this news, General Tommy Franks, the CENTCOM commander, told his subordinate that, "We're not staying, and we're going to take as much risk leaving Iraq as we did attacking it." This bold statement was clear evidence of the unfounded optimism, which often bordered on fantasy, which permeated both CENTCOM and the Pentagon, an evaluation of the situation which was founded on both political convenience and a profound level of ignorance. The generals decided to place the boundary between the 5th Corps and the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force at Baghdad. The army would take responsibility for all provinces to the north of the capital. The Marines would command everything to the south, with the exception of Basra, which was under a semi-independent British command. The 3rd Infantry Division, along with the 2nd Armoured Cavalry Regiment, remained in Baghdad, where it would eventually be relieved by the 1st Armoured Division and withdrawn. McKinnon had originally intended the 101st Airborne to operate in Baghdad as well, but with the growing crisis in the north, he ordered it to move to Mosul. It was the only unit with the organic air assets to rapidly redeploy large distances across Iraq. Major General Raymond Odierno's 4th Infantry Division relieved the Marines in the Saladin and Kirkuk provinces, and the soon-to-arrive 3rd Armoured Cavalry Regiment would deploy to Anbar to augment the light and predominantly special operations forces operating in the west. At Coalition Forces Land Component Command's direction, 5th Corps began developing Saddam International Airport, which was renamed Baghdad International Airport in mid-April, as the coalition's future headquarters in Iraq. By the end of the month, coalition forces had all deployed to their new areas of responsibility. The maneuver had not been an easy one. The conclusion of high-intensity combat operations found coalition formations strung out across southern and central Iraq, and several divisions had to deploy through one another, never a desirable operation. But despite these challenges, all of the units were now where 3rd Army Command wanted them. During this period, the 101st Airborne had conducted the longest air assault in history, moving over 500 kilometers from the Karbala Gap to Mosul, where a fractious security situation greeted them. During this precious 3-week period, almost all of the major formations underwent a relief in place, with new units replacing those which were currently deployed in that area. This process required the newly arriving formation to not only maneuver into place, deploy its combat, administrative, and logistical forces, and be briefed by their predecessor, but the old unit then had to withdraw and move to its new area of operations. Thus, the redeployment of the 3rd Army's divisions in late April was a very difficult and complex operation, one which demanded the full attention of the Army's various headquarters. As a consequence of this, and the immaturity of the planning for Phase 4, very few units had conducted extensive local security operations before they either had to redeploy or were relieved. Consequently, when these forces arrived in their new, unanticipated operational areas, they had to rapidly adjust to new and unfamiliar surroundings with very little background information or guidance from command. Making matters worse, during this period, Iraq's urban centers were in desperate need of security. As a consequence of this lack of central direction and the absence of detailed plans for Phase 4, each divisional headquarters was forced to adapt to the local circumstances they found themselves in. In Mosul, the 101st Airborne focused on the development of local political structures. They established a civil military operations center in the city and prepared to host local elections. Operations in the Sunni Triangle, however, were far more combat-focused. In Tikrit, the most fervent Saddamist stronghold, and an area which had never been cleared prior to the invasion, the 4th Infantry Division conducted heavy, aggressive, mechanized patrols, a posture that had been far more combative than the Marines which had preceded them. The 82nd Airborne had a similar experience in Anbar. They had been focusing on providing security for the Arba'een pilgrimage, the largest mass gathering in the world, but with its conclusion in April, the division transitioned to presence and security operations. Daily foot patrols within the city led to numerous contacts, although these were generally small in scale throughout this period. In the relatively peaceful south, the British and Marines focused on security and reconstruction operations. It was becoming clear to all that, although Coalition Forces Land Component Command had sufficient strength to successfully destroy the Iraqi military and topple Saddam's regime, just as US Army Chief of Staff General Erich Shinseki had predicted, there were nowhere near enough boots on the ground to secure Iraq, especially without the expected aid of the Iraqi army. On April the 15th, CENTCOM Command assessed that all Iraqi Army and Republican Guard formations had abandoned their positions and were combat ineffective. Various units received sporadic surrenders of senior military officers at the corps level and below, while Special Forces Joint Task Force 121 began hunting for the senior political and military leadership. Most of the Baathist and Fedayeen command were believed to have either fled the country or gone to ground in the major cities. Coalition forces were still encountering resistance throughout Iraq, however. Foot patrols would often receive sporadic sniper fire and the occasional larger ambush. 3rd Army headquarters assessed that this activity was solely the result of the presence of foreign fighters and jihadis. Complicating the situation facing coalition forces was the nearly daily protest in Saddamist strongholds such as Tikrit and Baghdad. When infantry units were engaged by sniper fire in the presence of a large number of agitated protesters, the prospects of mass collateral damage and civilian casualties was ever present. Of real concern was the first use of a weapon that would become synonymous with the Iraq War, the improvised explosive device, or IED. Especially when delivered by a vehicle, the IED would prove to be the most useful tool in the insurgents' arsenal, and a term that would put fear into coalition forces throughout the conflict. On April the 14th, Marines on patrol in Baghdad were seriously wounded when a man approached them and detonated an explosive vest he was wearing. The use of suicide bombers, either on foot or in a vehicle, would become a gruesome but all too common part of the conflict for years to come. Nevertheless, in reality, the situation was far worse than McKinnon and the other American commanders assessed. The lack of security throughout Iraq and the power vacuum left by the collapse of Saddam's regime allowed numerous other actors to operate within Iraq's often lawless cities. Unknown to the coalition at first, sectarian violence began almost immediately. The Shia majority had endured decades of repression under Saddam's Sunni regime, and within days, reprisal attacks began to occur across eastern Iraq. Under the command of Hadi al-Amiri, the Iranian-backed Baathist Corps had spent months preparing prescription lists of regime targets. According to the testimony of Iraqi politician Ali Alawi, within days of the end of major combat operations, the Baathist Corps initiated a killing spree throughout Shia Iraq. About 10,000 militiamen formed death squads and began roaming the streets, hunting and summarily executing former Sunni regime loyalists and Shia collaborators. Countless people were killed in these operations. By looting numerous Iraqi army depots, locations which had not yet been secured by coalition units, the Baathist Corps was now more well armed than it had ever been, and within days it had established footholds in Basra, Amara, Diyala, and Baghdad. The presence of Shia death squads rapidly precipitated the formulation of local militias in the Sunni areas, a development made all too easy in a society awash with weapons and where millions of men had undergone military training. By late April, British and Marine commanders were noting the disruptive presence of Iranian groups within their operational areas. Coalition command became concerned that Tehran was trying to establish shadow governments in the towns and cities of Shia Iraq, and in an attempt to delegitimize the coalition-backed local government, these proxy forces began inciting unrest. But it wasn't just the Iranians who were shedding blood in eastern Iraq. Within days of the regime's fall, a power struggle within Iraqi Shia politics raised its head. On April the 5th, Ayatollah Abdul Majid al-Qusay, the son of the former Grand Maja and a leader of the 1991 uprising, returned to Najaf from his 12-year exile in London. He was in Iraq for less than 24 hours before a mob dragged him out of the Imam Ali shrine and murdered him in a nearby shop. These were supporters of a man whose name would rise to become one of the most influential and infamous throughout the Iraq War, Muqtada al-Sadr. The son of a prominent Shia cleric, Sadr viewed Qusay as a Western-backed interloper. Although it was barely noticed at the time, this murder would have profound political and military consequences for both Iraq and the coalition. On May the 1st, US President George W. Bush stood at a podium on board the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln. Behind him, as the world watched on television, a grand banner adorned the carrier's island. On it, the words, "Mission Accomplished," blazed triumphantly across a fluttering American flag. Bush's speech was no less exultant. "My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed, and now our coalition is engaged in securing and reconstructing that country. In this battle, we have fought for the cause of liberty and for the peace of the world. Our nation and our coalition are proud of this accomplishment, yet it is you, the members of the United States military, who achieved it. Your courage, your willingness to face danger for your country and for each other made this day possible. Because of you, our nation is more secure. Because of you, the tyrant has fallen, and Iraq is free." The hubris of that speech, one made at a time when the first signs of an Iraqi civil war were beginning to reveal themselves, has become an object example of the perils of both optimism and arrogance. For many, this speech is the defining symbol of the war's folly, and the politicized cancer at the heart of Operation Iraqi Freedom, one which infected its planning, execution, and even political and legal justification. It was, perhaps for that very reason, one of the most famous days of the war. But another thing happened on May the 1st. CENTCOM formally announced the full transition to Phase 4 of Operation Iraqi Freedom, claiming that major combat operations had ended. It was this transition that spurred President Bush to make that unfortunate speech. But as later events would reveal, as opposed to being an afterthought, Phase 4 would prove to be by far the most challenging and bloody element of Operation Iraqi Freedom. In Iraq, the major ground force commanders watched the speech with a sense of astonishment. It was clear to them that the task was far from over. When Saddam's regime fell, it left a power vacuum that the coalition was simply unprepared to fill, and there was no alternative domestic political apparatus which could take its place. Thus, all throughout Iraq, various non-state actors moved to fill that void, all in a nation which was literally swimming in military weapons. With very little planning or direction from CENTCOM, the Coalition Forces Land Component Command's various divisions began conducting missions with the objective of destroying the remaining Iraqi military, stopping looting, providing basic security, containing demonstrations, delivering humanitarian assistance, reconstruction, and developing some form of local government. They did this without a common plan, across unit boundaries that simply did not match Iraq's ethnic, sectarian, and physical geography. As these disparate and thinly stretched forces tried to adapt to this very challenging situation, again without highly developed plans, they began to face a hidden enemy, one which employed novel tactics and had an organization which could not be easily identified. With so few boots on the ground, it was immediately clear that coalition forces simply could not deliver across so many simultaneous missions, nor could they provide enough security to prevent the emergence of large local militias. This inability to provide the Iraqi people with basic security drove a wedge between them and the coalition, precisely at a time where civilian leadership was about to apply some very misguided policies. Any goodwill that existed with the fall of Saddam was about to evaporate like a puddle in the scorching Iraqi summer. It was in this period, the summer of 2003, that the United States and its allies lost the initiative. Throughout this absolutely critical phase in the war, a period where the United States had a very real opportunity to turn an utterly brilliant operational triumph into real and lasting strategic victory, coalition military leadership drifted into listlessness. Over the course of the following 6 weeks, several key leaders and organizations left the country, as did large numbers of troops. The theater command was now thinly stretched. The new corps commander had arrived in Iraq a few weeks before as a divisional CO. This flux at theater command, and the absence of an established commander and their associated staff, left a significant vacuum at the operational level of warfare, which the various US Army, Marine, and British divisions filled by adapting to the local demands of their utterly distinct operational areas, an outcome of the heterogeneous nature of Iraqi society. As a consequence, different areas of the occupation saw vastly different coalition tactics across vastly different security environments. The lack of a centralized, doctrinal approach to the stabilization mission meant any hope of achieving theater-wide success was slim indeed. In spite of what General Franks had proclaimed, the military was unable to quickly turn over control to a civilian authority. When it arrived, the Coalition Provisional Authority was so poorly resourced that it was simply unable to take over governance from the military, at least at the operational level. Even as political leadership in Washington was deliberately withdrawing material support for the operation, these few coalition divisions and brigades struggled to contain a rapidly deteriorating situation. In truth, Iraqi society was simply imploding around them. From the beginning of the planning of the war, President Bush had determined that, after the fall of Saddam, the military would remain responsible for governance in Iraq until the local government was developed enough to take over. Thus, it would be the Department of Defense, as opposed to the Department of State, which would have the responsibility for governing Iraq. This would have the advantage of maintaining a single chain of command that ran through the Secretary of Defense to the President. To enact these plans, a new organization was formed, the Coalition Provisional Authority. The President and Secretary of Defense appointed Ambassador Louis Paul Bremer to lead it. A reasonably prominent figure in conservative foreign relations circles, Bremer had served as US ambassador to the Netherlands and had significant academic experience in counterterrorism. Although he didn't identify as a neoconservative himself, Bremer was certainly influenced by the key themes in neoconservative thought, specifically the moral righteousness and realist national utility of actively spreading liberal democracy, even at the point of a bayonet. After the president made these determinations and confirmed that Bremer would lead the Coalition Provisional Authority, the ambassador spent a mere 2 weeks in Washington, receiving briefings and assembling his team, after which he departed for Baghdad. The result of all this impromptu haste was a Coalition Provisional Authority that was anemically manned by inexperienced civilians and, thus, was manifestly unprepared for the colossal challenge which lay ahead of it. Bremer's limited resources were immediately dispersed amongst the critical areas of oil, civil affairs, economics, aid, operations, security affairs, and press and public affairs. In fact, he was so poorly resourced that much of the CPA had to be staffed by the military, further diluting the number of available staff officers within the theatre. But even as this increased command burden was being imposed by the transition to the Coalition Provisional Authority, Rumsfeld continued to strip resources out of Iraq. In yet another act of hubris, with the transition from Phase 3 to Phase 4 operations announced on May the 1st, the Secretary of Defense decided to downgrade the theatre headquarters. Coalition Forces Land Component Command had originally been an Army-level headquarters, essentially staffed by the 3rd Army HQ and commanded by General McKiernan. But with Washington's steadfast view that the war was now essentially over, Rumsfeld decided to completely alter the command organisation. McKiernan and the 3rd Army headquarters were abruptly ordered to return to Kuwait. Coalition Forces Land Component Command was rebranded as Combined Joint Task Force 7, which would be composed of the 5th Corps headquarters. This new formation would be led by the newly minted Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez. Just as Generals McKiernan and Wallace were grappling with a rapidly deteriorating and highly complex situation in Iraq, both of them were ordered to leave immediately and take the bulk of the staff officers with them. The folly of this course of action was readily apparent to both generals, who were very concerned by Iraq's trajectory. But with civil-military relations becoming ever more strained, the best they could achieve was delaying the command transition until June the 15th. Indeed, Rumsfeld had nearly replaced Wallace in the middle of the invasion. He had become irritated by the general's assessment that the Fedayeen had been an unplanned enemy, and thus had not acted aggressively enough during the invasion. Considering the blistering speed displayed by the US military in the conventional phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom, the contention that the Corps commander responsible for taking Baghdad in 3 weeks had not been aggressive enough is a hard objection to sustain. Wallace, and his replacement, Sanchez, had expected the command transition to occur in September or October, but Rumsfeld's impatience led to this occurring with undue haste at a time of very significant vulnerability. During this same 45-day time period, many key members of US military high command also departed. General Tommy Franks, the architect of the conventional phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom, retired from CENTCOM command. This had been planned for some time, and with the conventional phase over, many around him thought General Franks was becoming disconnected from events in Iraq. His replacement, General Abizaid, had not yet been confirmed by Congress. Highly experienced in Middle Eastern affairs and a man of Lebanese descent, Abizaid was an excellent choice for CENTCOM commander. However, the transition occurred at a highly inopportune point in the campaign. At this same time, the US Army Chief of Staff, General Shinseki, also retired. An example of just how toxic civil-military relations had become at the Pentagon, neither Rumsfeld nor Wolfowitz attended his retirement party. Wolfowitz asked if he could come, but the Deputy Secretary was simply not invited. Shinseki was the second 4-star general who retired under Rumsfeld's relatively short stint as Secretary of Defense. In late 2001, just weeks after 9/11, General Henry Sheldon resigned as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Reportedly, he was disgusted with Secretary Rumsfeld and his careless disregard for sound military advice. As Shinseki's replacement, Rumsfeld overlooked the Army's currently serving 3- and 4-star generals and selected an outsider, the retired General Paul Shoemaker. This only served to deepen the rift in civil-military relations under Rumsfeld at a time in which the window of opportunity to not just win the war, but win the peace was steadily closing. Thus, just as the very fabric of Iraqi society was beginning to unwind and the simmering sectarian tensions which the Baathist regime had kept a firm lid on were beginning to boil over, the United States military was being badly drained of both combat and, most importantly, intellectual resources. Although the decision to limit the number of follow-on forces was clearly a very significant mistake, the flux in command across the hierarchy was perhaps the most damaging element of this process. During this period, the US military was facing a challenging and complex situation for which it was not well prepared, from a doctrinal, training, or experiential perspective. The Army had been focusing obsessively on conventional, high-intensity conflict with a peer opponent since the early 1980s, and the development of air-land battle doctrine. as the world witnessed across both Operations Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom, this had arguably made it the greatest proponent of maneuver warfare the world had seen since the Second World War, or, perhaps, even throughout all of military history. But this was a very, very different situation. The coalition's heavily armed divisions were no longer trying to outmaneuver and destroy enemy formations entirely comparable to their own. Now they found themselves right in the middle of one of the most ethnically, religiously, and culturally diverse nations in the Middle East, a country that was on the verge of civil war, without clear guidance or a well-developed doctrinal framework to guide them. Now, more than ever, the US military needed its most capable and experienced officers to help guide the force through this most challenging environment, one which required rapid innovation and adaptability, especially in the areas of tactics and force protection. Yet, just at that most vulnerable moment, where strategic success was still possible, Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz, to whom the president had delegated immense responsibility, decided to remove most of the coalition's senior command and the intellectual and administrative resources at their disposal. Only making this dire situation worse was the Coalition Provisional Authority. A civilian authority which could generously be called amateurish, the CPA was understaffed, under-resourced, and under-experienced. In fact, the half-assed nature of the civilian oversight of Phase 4, exemplified by the establishment of a very powerful organisation which had been thrown together over a period of just 2 weeks, is revealing of not only Rumsfeld's arrogance and negligence, but a kind of contemptuous apathy. He was sure in his belief that stabilising Iraq was going to be just as easy as toppling Saddam's regime, and the institutionalised naysayers in the military had simply failed to comprehend both the changed nature of warfare heralded by the arrival of the RMA and the hospitable political situation in Iraq. This conceit and the refusal to adhere to sound military advice would lead the United States and its allies into disaster. During May, coalition forces began searching Iraq for weapons of mass destruction. Given how large Saddam's WMD program had been in the 1980s and 1990s, which included an extremely large expenditure of domestically produced chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq War, both sulfur mustard and the nerve agents, coalition political and military command were confident that large stockpiles of these weapons, and the facilities used to produce them, would be quickly found. After all, and despite the weak intelligence assessments upon which it was founded, the Bush administration had expended vast political and diplomatic capital in building the WMD casus belli. None realistically expected finding evidence of Iraq's WMD program to be a difficult undertaking. Thus, the task had been allocated to the 75th Field Artillery Brigade. In fact, CENTCOM had been so confident that exploiting the WMD sites would be an easy task that the allocation of the 75th Brigade had been something of an afterthought. However, within days of landing in Iraq, the brigade's leadership quickly realised that they were poorly equipped to handle this enormous task. Not only were the number of possible WMD sites to be investigated massive, the brigade had no access to Iraqi government documents concerning the WMD program. Its units rushed around Iraq from site to site on the mere rumour of WMDs, but within a month absolutely nothing had been found. For obvious reasons, this was immensely concerning to Washington. If the Iraqi WMD program existed, as they believed it did, as it had undoubtedly existed across the prior decades, then surely some significant stockpile or facility should have been immediately found. But the silence was quickly becoming deafening. By the end of May, it was decided to augment the 75th Brigade with a much larger Iraq Survey Group, an organisation which would be staffed by hundreds of personnel from the intelligence community. As this period of flux and transition was occurring across the force, Ambassador Bremer landed in Iraq. His arrival was hardly harmonious. Within days, clear differences of opinion arose between the CPA and 5th Corps headquarters about both the nature of the command structure within the theatre and the manner in which the stabilisation mission should be conducted. Nominally, Bremer and the CPA operated under the authority of the Secretary of Defense. However, the ambassador behaved as though he was a presidential envoy who had effectively been delegated presidential power. Indeed, comments he made at the time indicated that he considered himself to be as powerful as General MacArthur had once been in post-war Japan. Thus, he considered the CPA to be the primary authority within Iraq and tended to issue orders to the military directly. Meanwhile, General Sanchez and Combined Joint Task Force 7 headquarters believed that the two organizations acted in unison, and the military would be free to set their own priorities and direct their own operations in order to achieve objectives set by the Coalition Provisional Authority. Within hours, this difference of opinion led to significant tension between the headquarters. In yet another act of negligence, General Abizaid later remembered that Rumsfeld had never made the nature of this relationship clear to CENTCOM. This underlying tension, an outcome of the confused hierarchy and command relationships between Bremer and Sanchez, only made strategic and operational discussions more difficult, and Bremer was on the verge of enacting 3 policies that would quite literally found the Iraqi insurgency. The coalition of the willing had invaded Iraq with the stated objective of removing the Baathist regime. However, one core assumption which had underpinned planning for the operation was that, beyond the upper levels of the regime itself, the state administrative and legal apparatus would essentially remain intact. The plan had not originally been to refound Iraq as a new nation state, but simply to remove the Baath Party from power. Another core assumption, one which had underpinned the notion that the invasion could be conducted with such meagre forces, was the idea that the coalition would have assistance from the Iraqi military to maintain security and stability as a new Iraqi provisional government was formed and eventually granted power. However, once Bremer arrived, he made a series of decisions which would far more dramatically increase the impact of the invasion on the Iraqi state, society, and people, and thus create a power and governance vacuum across all levels of Iraq. In doing so, the CPA precipitated a process of violent fragmentation that would propel the land of the two rivers into full-blown civil war. In the first weeks of the Coalition Provisional Authority's establishment in Baghdad, it was clear that the question of the legal status of the Baath Party and the Iraqi army had to be addressed. For months prior to the invasion, the National Security Committee had been working on a de-Baathification plan for post-war Iraq. Both the NSC and CENTCOM agreed that the party itself should be outlawed, but, as Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice put it, the question was to what degree we were going to allow government employees and military people to retain their positions. Like virtually all one-party states, in order to be anyone in Saddam's Iraq, you effectively had to be a member of the Baath Party. This was also true of Nazi Germany, and to a lesser degree, Communist China today. Many members of the governmental bureaucracy, including teachers, engineers, economists, and administrators, were technically members of the Baath Party, but that did not mean that these people were active supporters of Saddam or were politically active. The general thought amongst most American officers was that only the top 2 levels of the party, a number of people that represented only a tiny fraction of Iraqi society, should be prohibited from holding government office, with only a few specific exceptions. All other members could simply denounce the Baathist Party and resume their position within the government. Thus, the vast majority of the Iraqi governmental apparatus could remain intact, allowing the country to function largely as it had prior to the invasion. CENTCOM had decided to disband some elements of the army which were the most loyal to Saddam, including the Republican Guard, but allow a good portion of the General Staff and Officer Corps to remain through the application of a relatively forgiving de-Baathification policy. A little over 5 divisions of the Iraqi regular army, around 100,000 personnel in total, would remain intact, a force which would be used to supplement the coalition divisions in providing security. This force would then be the nucleus of a larger Iraqi army which would serve the Iraqi provisional government once it was formed, allowing it to maintain security and offset Iranian influence. The other security services would also essentially remain intact. Had this plan been implemented, as many within the American military had intended, the story of the Iraq War may have been a very different one indeed. Nevertheless, Ambassador Bremer arrived in Baghdad with a very different vision for the future of the Iraqi state. Bremer had not been a member of either CENTCOM or the NSC, and thus had not been part of the relatively thorough discussions prior to the invasion. After all, he had only been allocated 2 weeks to prepare for this mission, and thus he simply lacked the luxury of time to canvass widely amongst CENTCOM and the NSC for guidance. He took his orders directly from one man, Donald Rumsfeld. On the 9th of May, one day before he departed Washington, Bremer received his directions. In that memorandum, he was ordered to actively oppose all legacy organizations loyal to Saddam, including the Baath Party as a whole and the security apparatus. After receiving these orders, Bremer visited the Undersecretary for Defense, Douglas Feith. In that meeting, Feith showed Bremer a draft de-Baathification order which had been prepared by Rumsfeld. As opposed to just 2, this order outlawed the top 4 levels of the party from holding positions of governmental authority. This would dramatically increase the number of affected positions to around 50,000 people, some of the most important and influential in Iraqi society. Included in this order were engineers, the most experienced civil servants, and even university professors, people who were critical to a well-functioning modern nation-state. Bremer later recalled that he believed this order had been approved by the White House, Department of Defense, and Department of State, and thus determined that it was so important that he should deliver and implement it himself, an action which would establish his authority within Iraq. However, no one outside the Secretary of Defense's office had seen it. In terms of American policy towards the former Iraqi regime and security apparatus, Bremer's thoughts had clearly been shaped by conversations his senior advisor for defense and security affairs, Walter B. Slocum, had held in May with both Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz. There, he had been convinced that most Iraqis feared the return of Saddam's oppressive security services, that the Iraqi army was not representative of the Shia majority, and, in any case, had dissolved of its own accord in the wake of coalition conventional victory. This position was in stark contrast to the view held by the wider US military leadership and National Security Council. On May the 19th, Bremer sent a memorandum to Rumsfeld recommending that all of Iraq's security institutions be disbanded. The Iraqi Intelligence Service, the Directorate of General Security, National Security Bureau, the Ministry of Information, and in fact the entire Ministry of Defense were to be dissolved. Additionally, not only the Republican Guard, but every arm of the legacy Iraqi military, including the regular army, air force, and navy, were to be immediately disbanded. Rumsfeld agreed. Once he arrived in Baghdad, Bremer discussed these proposals with CENTCOM Command. To no avail, General Abizaid strongly disagreed to both Bremer and General Franks. In fact, he characterized the proposals as extreme. Abizaid later recalled, "I think the model that was being used in Washington was the World War II model of denazification. Saddam was Hitler, the Republican Guards the SS, and the Ba'ath Party the Nazi Party. This notion of this great crusade against evil had no bearing in reality to what was on the ground and the historical context of Middle Eastern politics and Iraq politics in particular. It's easy to demonize many neoconservatives as ruthless Machiavellian imperialists, and it is true that realism was a cornerstone of the neoconservative movement. Nonetheless, we should not discount the role idealism had in shaping many of these policies. Men like Wolfowitz appeared to earnestly believe that liberal democracy, globally actualized by American military power, was both a force for good in the world and served Washington's interest. Much of their statements and writing prior to the invasion reveals just how much influence the Second World War had on the worldview of prominent neoconservatives. For Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld, Nazi Germany was a model for Baathist Iraq. It was a morally repugnant and odious political movement and regime that needed to be physically purged from human civilization writ large. Thus, total de-Baathification was the only way to ensure Baathism would not re-emerge. The fact that the particular details of Iraqi political society, history, and culture made the analogy with Nazi Germany a crude one at best did not give Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, or Bremer pause. Despite the enormity of the decision, it was just May the 16th, 2003, when Bremer issued CPA Order 1, de-Baathification, which purged all who inhabited the top 4 levels of the party. That day, between 30,000 and 50,000 Iraqis, some of the most important people within the Iraqi state, were made unemployed. Later analysis conducted by historians had concluded that the more moderate de-Baathification proposal, which had been approved by the NSC and President prior to the invasion, were either simply not given to Bremer or were summarily overruled by the Secretary of Defense's office. Either way, it was clearly Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz's policy that Bremer was implementing in Iraq, not the military's, national security committees, or presidents. Iraq was still reeling from the impact of CPA Order 1 when it was rocked by Bremer's second and most consequential move. Just 4 days after communicating to Rumsfeld his intentions and mere weeks into his tenure, Bremer released CPA Order 2, the dissolution of entities. At a stroke of a pen, all of Iraq's security services were immediately disbanded and all payments to members of staff were summarily cancelled. Worse, As most of the security services leadership, even at middle levels, were level 4 members of the Baath Party, none could hope to be gainfully employed in Bremer's new Iraq. This action had not been taken in concert with coalition military leadership. In fact, Brigadier General Mark Hertling, assistant commander of the 1st Armoured Division, was literally in the middle of addressing a gathering of 600 senior Iraqi officers in Baghdad to solicit their participation in the reconstitution of the Iraqi army when an aide informed him of the CPA's announcement. When the Iraqi officers heard the news, the meeting disbanded. Within days, angry crowds of now unemployed soldiers protested across Iraq, leading to several violent clashes with coalition forces. Reportedly, this action was taken against the clear advice of coalition military leadership, who were actively planning to use the Iraqi army to help provide security. Even British officers espoused very significant skepticism about the idea. This was perhaps the most consequential decision taken by an American administrator or official in Iraq. Upon reflection, it was probably the one decision that did the most to foster the Iraqi insurgency in all of its mutated, metastasized forms. Despite the widespread criticism over the preceding years, both Bremer and other prominent neoconservatives have steadfastly defended this decision. In a moment of real political irony, in 2005, Bremer opined that CPA Order 2 had been critical in avoiding a civil war in Iraq by ensuring the Kurds were reassured that the United States was intent on making serious changes in Iraq. But the real defense mounted by the neoconservative rear guard was the contention that there was no Iraqi army in May 2003. Rumsfeld and Bremer were later adamant that CPA Order 2 simply formalized a state of affairs which already existed. There was no Iraqi army. President Bush later recalled, "I always felt to the extent that we could use the Iraqi army as a stabilizing force, it would be a plus. But the problem is that, when we got there, there was no Iraqi army left. They just evaporated. There was no structure. I remember Bremer telling me that we disbanded the army, but there was no army to begin with." Bremer and Rumsfeld's defense of CPA Order 2 was, and is, not to put too fine a point on it, nonsense. Whilst it is technically true that most Iraqi army personnel had abandoned their units and returned home, this did not mean the army as a whole ceased to exist, but rather that it had simply demobilized. There is no reason to believe that had these men, who were now effectively unemployed, been publicly recalled by their officers, that most would not have simply reported to their barracks and returned to duty. Indeed, during April, when Bremer, Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld were finalizing their plans, Lieutenant General J. Garner, Brenner's immediate predecessor and highest-ranking civilian administrator in Iraq, and Colonel Paul Hughes were in contact with numerous high-ranking Iraqi officers who wished to recall tens of thousands of soldiers to duty and reorganize their units with American assistance. Garner had arranged an emergency payment of $20 to each officer so they could buy essentials for their families, and were finalizing plans to deploy several Iraqi army divisions to guard the Iranian border. These discussions were still ongoing when Bremer's order brought them to an immediate and unceremonious end. In any case, the simple fact that CPA Order 2 precipitated protests across Iraq is crystalline evidence that tens of thousands of men believed that they were still part of an Iraqi army. But it wasn't just American officers on the ground who Bremer's order caught by surprise. It had a similar effect in Washington. Both the president and most of his advisors were caught off guard by Bremer's sweeping and immensely consequential decisions, actions that set Iraq on a path to insurgency and civil war. President Bush later recalled that Bremer had called him to advise him of the decision to disband the army, not to seek advice or provide him with several options. In fact, Bremer's policy had effectively countermanded the president's pre-war directive that the Iraqi army should be retained. Despite the fact that Bremer had effectively disobeyed the president's original guidance, Bush later recalled that he believed that, as commander-in-chief, he should trust the decisions of his people on the ground and avoid micromanaging affairs from Washington. This hands-off approach was a hallmark of his presidency, and despite how admirable his intentions may have been, this disengagement allowed powerful actors within the administration, such as Cheney and Rumsfeld, to effectively implement their own policies. Despite his reluctance to do so, in the following months Bush reined Bremer in, requiring direct contact every few days and more consultation on matters of strategic importance. With the fallout of CPA Order 2 now rocking the country, Bremer quickly announced plans to form a new Iraqi army, but unsurprisingly these did little to calm the growing storm. In yet another act of hasty improvisation, it was only on May the 9th that a concrete plan to reconstitute the Iraqi army was implemented. That day, Major General Paul Eaton, commander of the Army Infantry School at Fort Benning, was given orders to deploy to Iraq. He was to head the Coalition Military Assistance Training Team. Despite its impressive name, CMAT was only composed of a skeleton of training staff and contracted military trainers. It was given the mission of training and raising 27 motorized infantry battalions, just 3 divisions, over a period of 2 years. This force was large enough to provide domestic security, but little else. It certainly wasn't of sufficient size to pose a threat to its neighbours, but neither was it enough to defend Iraq from said neighbours. This was an utterly inadequate alternative to the complete dissolution of the Iraqi security services and army writ large, and did nothing to quell the growing anger of the legacy military. There were still hundreds of thousands of soldiers and intelligence officers who were now angry, hungry, and unemployed. Despite the magnitude of these 2 decisions, orders that were of the utmost consequence for both the war and the Iraqi state, the Coalition Provisional Authority was not done yet. Even as the aftershocks of CPA Order 2 were still being felt across the country, Bremer issued CPA Order 3, Weapons Control. This order forbade Iraqi citizens, who were not employed by the police or military, from possessing firearms, grenades, RPGs, and other munitions. Over and above the former military, this order outraged virtually all sectors of Iraqi society. Especially in rural areas, weapons were part of an Iraqi lifestyle and culture. Most households contained at least one firearm, and it was normal for political militias to display their arms in public. Even before the invasion, for many families and communities, firearms were a critical tool, enabling them to defend themselves, their homes, and their neighborhoods. As the coalition had shown their complete inability to provide security for most Iraqis, this need had only become more acute after the invasion. With Shia death squads such as the Baathist Corps roaming the streets of many Iraqi cities, the idea that Sunni militias were going to be forced to give up their only means of defending their neighborhoods was certainly something which many average Iraqis felt was worth fighting to prevent. Additionally, with so few coalition personnel on the ground and no Iraqi army to help them, this order was effectively impossible to implement. There were quite literally millions of firearms in Iraq, many of which were easily accessed from unsecured Iraqi army depots. Some estimates put the total number of small arms in Iraq at a minimum of 8 million, most of which were AKMs. Thus, given the impossibility of enforcement, one has to seriously question the wisdom of antagonizing large elements of Iraqi society with this order, effectively driving an even larger wedge between the Iraqi people and the coalition. Unbelievably, Bremer's disastrous first month at the CPA was not over. In the quadfecta, through the seemingly banal CPA Order 4, establishment of the Iraqi Property Reconciliation Facility, Bremer had effectively worsened instability by marginalizing Iraqi tribes and deepening divisions between them, institutions and a culture which Bremer and other CPA officials considered backward. It had been quite a month for Ambassador Bremer and the Coalition Provisional Authority. In a matter of weeks, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and Bremer had significantly reduced the personnel footprint in Iraq by ensuring the 1st Cavalry Division was not deployed, had denuded the intellectual and leadership resources available to the coalition by not only removing the 3rd Army headquarters from Iraq and making the whole theatre a corps-level operation, but ordered the early replacement of the 5th Corps commander, had driven civil-military relations to such a point that numerous generals preferred retirement to continued command in active wars, had, at the stroke of a pen and in contrast to a presidential directive, completely dissolved the Iraqi security services and most of the wider administrative bureaucracy's leadership, had antagonized otherwise peaceful elements of Iraqi society by outlawing their weapons, potentially leaving them completely vulnerable to ethnic and sectarian violence, and, finally, had antagonized Iraqi tribal leadership. It had been a truly astounding display of reckless arrogance, hubris, and incompetence. These were all manifestly poor decisions, and many had been taken in direct aversion to the expert advice of not only the military, but the National Security Committee. It's not hard to see why the CPA performed so badly. Like much of the planning and execution of Phase 4 of Operation Iraqi Freedom, it was an organisation that had been thrown together at the last minute, and then given the very dangerous combination of enormous power and insufficient oversight and direction. The fact that Rumsfeld effectively undermined the president and NSC, countermanding their directive and then implementing a de-Baathification plan developed by the Secretary of Defense, is revealing of the pathology of Bush's first term. Despite his very successful stint as governor of Texas, during his first years, President Bush was still a relatively inexperienced national leader and politician, and thus he relied heavily on his more experienced subordinates for advice and direction, a trait amplified by his easygoing personality. This allowed shrewd political operators such as Rumsfeld and Cheney to pursue their own agendas, and the divergence between Bush and Rumsfeld on the question of the Iraqi army is revealing of that pathology. Unity of command is an absolutely foundational principle which underpins effective military operations, and having disparate elements of the administration pulling in different directions only led to dysfunction. The consequences of these decisions, most of which were again in contrast to the direction of CENTCOM, the NSC and White House, were enormous. At a stroke of a pen, Bremer had taken the most militarily capable people in Iraq and made them enemies of not only the coalition, but the yet-to-be-formed Provisional Iraqi government. Military officers of all ranks, Iraqi special forces, intelligence officers, secret police, and the rank and file of the Iraqi army, most of whom were not true ideological Baathists or loyal to Saddam, were now not only stripped of the power and privilege they had once held within Iraqi society, but had been made destitute. Many proud military men, individuals who had pursued a career in an army which had been a bedrock institution of modern Iraq dating back to British rule, were now no better than beggars, unable to feed their families. It's not hard to imagine the resentment Bremer's actions generated. These are actually the kind of people who are capable of organising an insurgency, and Bremer had just made enemies of hundreds of thousands of them. This was effectively pouring gasoline on the smouldering bonfire of sectarian and ethnic tensions that is modern Iraq, a nation with not only a deep religious divide, but strong centrifugal forces driven by regional ethnic and cultural differences, divisions, and resentments, which had been made all the more deep by decades of Sunni oppression under Saddam. Even as the fuse lit by the Coalition Provisional Authority had started to burn, the US military continued with its far too optimistic planning for a transition to civilian control. After the change in the command structure was enacted on June the 15th, the new theatre headquarters faced an ever-growing set of challenges with ever-dwindling resources. Franks was adamant that the invasion force should be withdrawn to the United States immediately, and thus the 3rd Infantry Division and 1st Marine Expeditionary Force were to redeploy as quickly as possible. Of the remaining formations, the 4th Infantry, 1st Armoured and 101st Airborne Divisions would remain in country for just an additional 120 days before also withdrawing. Despite the very poor security situation across most of Iraq, General Franks decided to accept this plan as he felt that it was imperative that the United States demonstrate to all that it was in the process of liberating, rather than occupying, Iraq. However, it rapidly became evident that the consequence of these decisions was simply to drive the development of a stateless theatre of war, as Bremer had effectively dissolved the most critical elements of the Iraqi state apparatus, with a civilian and military command that were manifestly incapable of controlling the highly dynamic and dangerous situation. A corps-level headquarters and its attached intelligence cell were woefully inadequate to the task of managing a theatre as large and complex as Iraq. It also lacked the larger logistics capability and organic civil affairs or strategic communications elements that were present in an army-level headquarters. During mid-2003, the CPA staffing levels only ever reached 65%, a third of which were military officers which had to be borrowed from the 5th Corps HQ. Without these loans, its manning levels would have been as low as 40%. This was the supreme civilian authority in post-Saddam Iraq, one vested with nearly royal power. But the military command was just as under-resourced. During the invasion, Coalition Forces Land Component Command, the bedrock of which was the 3rd Army Headquarters, contained a total staff of 1,200, including a dedicated intelligence detachment of over 400 personnel. With an arguably more challenging task ahead of him, the total number of staff available to General Sanchez's headquarters was just 280. He estimated he required as many as 700, especially considering how many personnel were on loan to the CPA. But finding people to fill these positions was becoming increasingly difficult. After all, this command was scheduled to be dissolved in 3 months, hardly making it an attractive posting for many officers. Coalition partners did what they could to fill the gap, including the deployment of 40 British officers. But with the conception that the war was largely over dominant in Washington, General Sanchez struggled to gain any additional resources. When 5th Corps became Combined Joint Task Force 7 on June the 15th, its operational area of responsibility covered all of Iraq with the exception of the Kurdish provinces of Dahuk, Erbil, and Salamanya. The remaining 15 provinces were divided into 6 distinct areas of operations, each of which was commanded by divisional headquarters. These were very different, each with its own mix of geography, sectarianism, ethnicity, and tribal alliances. In the north, the 101st Airborne Division was responsible for a vast, mountainous border area. Here the international boundaries were highly porous, routes that smugglers had employed for generations. Along the Syrian, Turkish, and Iranian borders, the 101st area also included the semi-autonomous Kurdish regions, which were administered by the friendly Kurdistan Regional Government, which was jointly ruled by the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan and Kurdistan Democratic Party. This area extended along the Iranian border. The remote mountainous terrain made the area a haven for organised crime and terrorist organisations, such as Zarqawi's Jamaat al-Tawhid al-Jihad and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which had been waging an insurgency in Turkey for decades. In the centre of this area of operations was the highly populous Nineveh province. With a population of 2 million, its capital city, Mosul, was the third largest in Iraq, and it was here that the division established its headquarters. Nineveh was a highly diverse region. Its population is predominantly a mix of Kurds and Sunni Arabs, although there are significant minorities of ethnic Turkomans, Shia Arabs, and Christians. Finally, the area inhabited by the Yazidis stretched across the province's plains to the Sinjar mountain range extending west into Syria. Just to the south of the 101st Airborne was the 4th Infantry Division's area of operations. This region was composed of the Salahuddin, Tamin, and Diyala provinces. The capital of Tamin province, Kirkuk, had been the focal point for conflict between the Arabs and the Kurds, and thus between the Kurdish autonomous regions and the rest of Iraq. The Kirkuk oil fields were a significant point of contention between the two groups, as control of this strategically vital asset was not only important for the national economy as a whole, but would grant either group significant leverage and resources. Just to the west of Kirkuk lay Saladin province. This contained the city of Tikrit, Saddam's hometown and the traditional centre of power in Baathist Iraq. Saladin province, which was separated from Kurdistan by the Hamrin Mountains, also contained the Tigris River cities of Samarra and Balad. Saladin is predominantly a Sunni Arab area. Across the Jabal Hamrin Mountains from Saladin sits the province of Diyala. This area is a strategic crossroads. Its flat terrain offered easy access to Baghdad and also major routes to the Iranian border. The geography of Diyala is dominated by olive groves, citrus orchards, and small villages, ideal country to wage an insurgency. The capital of Diyala, Bakuba, sat right on the country's great sectarian fault line. The suburbs to the west of the city near the Tigris River were dominated by Sunnis, whilst the rest of the city to the east of the Diyala River were Shia areas. Further up the Diyala Valley, the towns of Jalwala and Karnakin sat on similar fault lines between Arabs and Kurds. Finally, Diyala is a very fertile region crisscrossed with canals and irrigation systems over which local tribes were willing to fight. These ethnic and religious tensions made the 4th Infantry Division's area of operations not only a likely focal point for an anti-coalition insurgency, but held the potential for full-blown sectarian violence and civil war. To the south of the 4th Infantry Division, right in the centre of Iraq, lay the 1st Armoured Division's area. This was centred on the capital city of Baghdad and its 6 outlying districts, Abu Ghraib, Istiqlal, Madain, Mahmudiyah, Tajil, and Tarmiya. At that time, more than 7 million people lived in Baghdad, a quarter of the country's population, and the city represented a true melting pot of different religions, ethnicities, and cultures. It was roughly the size of Los Angeles. One of the northern suburbs of Baghdad, the newly renamed Sada City, was one of the most densely populated and poorest in the country. Essentially a Shia Arab slum, over 2 million people. Tribesmen from the southern wetlands who had been forcibly relocated by Saddam were crammed into its 13 square kilometres. Baghdad, Saddam's centre of gravity, had been the focal point of the Republican Guard's defences, with several fortified belts ringing the city prior to the invasion. Thus, with the dissolution of these units, the area was awash with weapons. West of Baghdad stood massive Anbar province, which was occupied by the 3rd Armoured Cavalry Regiment. Quite literally the size of Arkansas, Anbar is a sprawling province which contains the borders with Jordan, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. Anbar is dominated by a sparsely populated desert. The majority of its population is concentrated in the fertile Euphrates River Valley. Most of the province is dominated by the massive Jazira Desert, which stretches south from the great Anatolian mountains of Turkey through to the border with Saudi Arabia. Anbar's other desert, the Hajara, contained a rich topographical mix of rocky outcrops, wadis, and ridges. This brutal terrain was home to some of Iraq's toughest Sunni tribes, many of whom's historical lands crossed the borders with Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. Anbar contained some of the most important cities within the Sunni triangle. Fallujah, situated on the banks of the Euphrates River, and a town known as the City of Mosques, had long been a center of conservative Sunni Islam and an Islamist breeding ground. Although Anbar's capital, Ramadi, shared a similar history and demographics, Fallujah was likely to be a focal point for jihadis and the Islamist insurgency writ large. The primary ground lines of communication in Anbar are Highway 10 and Highway 1, which connected Baghdad with the Jordanian border. In the central region to the south of Baghdad was an area of operations which had been adopted by the Marines of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. This area was almost as massive as Anbar. It included the provinces of Najaf, Karbala, Babil, and Wasit. It was about the size of the US state of West Virginia. These provinces represented the heartland of the great Shia majority, and Najaf had long been the theological and ideological center of Shia Islam in Iraq. Indeed, the city of Karbala has extensive historical significance within the Shia religion, dating right back to the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE, where the Prophet Muhammad's grandson, Hussein ibn Ali, was killed by a Syrian army. His shrine and burial place is still one of the most holy sites in Shia Islam, and it is guarded by faithful Shia to this day. Najaf is the home of the modern satirist movement and would be the epicenter of the Shia insurgency. This wider region, including the city of Hilla, which is the site of the ancient city of Babylon, is lush and well watered. The countryside is adorned with palm groves and irrigation canals. To the very south of the country lay the British area of operations. Under the headquarters of the British 1st Armoured Division, coalition forces here occupied Basra, Masayan, Dikar, and Qadisiyah provinces. This represented an operational area that was approximately half the size of England. The city of Basra had a population of over 2 million and formed the focal point of British operations. In close proximity to the city are most of Iraq's oil reserves, including the massive Rumaila oil field. This part of Iraq is dominated by Shia Arabs and was heavily contested during the Iran-Iraq War. Despite the nationalist aversion to Iran, several Iranian-backed political and military actors were active in the Basra area, and the close proximity to the Iranian border and Kuwait made it a strategically vital region. As can clearly be seen, the 5 1/3 divisions, which constituted the 5th Corps, now had a responsibility for 6 vastly different geographical areas, each of which had its own particular ethnic, religious, and sectarian challenges, and without the aid of the Iraqi army, none had a sufficient footprint to provide enough influence across its entire area of operations. Furthermore, it was commanded by a corps headquarters that was so understaffed that it was struggling to simply keep pace with events. Without a clear and modern doctrinal paradigm to guide them, at least one that could be readily applied to the particular ethno-religious landscape of Iraq, and insufficient guidance from theatre command, either 5th Corps or CENTCOM, including a clear operational level campaign plan, the various district headquarters were simply forced to employ tactics and operations as each of the local command groups saw fit. This process revealed significant cultural differences between the various divisions, which led to the application of very different approaches across different areas of Iraq. Despite some notable successes, this lack of doctrinal coherence was not a recipe for victory in Iraq as a whole. Throughout May and June, the conditions facing the various divisions were already starting to rapidly diverge. In the north, the 101st Airborne worked steadily towards the establishment of a local Iraqi government. Working with local neighborhood leaders, which are known as Muqtars, and tribal sheikhs, the division was able to successfully hold an election for mayor of Mosul and provincial governor. With these institutions now in place, the 101st then focused on training, arming, and enabling a true multi-ethnic police force. In Basra, the British were adopting a similar approach. British counterinsurgency doctrine had been heavily influenced by their extensive experience in Northern Ireland. Infantry patrols began to focus on engaging with the local population. Even small differences, such as not wearing a helmet or sunglasses when moving through the city and stopping to speak with leaders in the neighbourhood, were notable successes. At the division level, operations in Basra focused on rebuilding the city's destroyed infrastructure and maintaining law and order. Many local farmers were becoming increasingly concerned by the fate of the date palm harvest, which had been disrupted by the invasion. Requests were made to assist with crop sprays and harvesting, and thus the British Army found themselves acting as de facto farmers. But in other areas of Iraq, the situation was already deteriorating. Deep in the Sunni Triangle, the 4th Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne and 3rd Cavalry Regiment were beginning to encounter daily contacts. Across Anbar, American forces were contending with violent protests, the worst of which occurred in Fallujah, Ramadi, and Habaniya. By June, these were daily occurrences, and despite substantial aid from the newly formed police force, the regiment struggled to impose order. With these violent encounters growing in number and intensity, and increasing concerns about the state of the border with Syria, Sanchez decided to redeploy more significant forces to Anbar. The 3rd Armoured Cavalry Regiment was relieved in place by the 3rd Infantry Division, which had not yet been withdrawn. This allowed the regiment to focus completely on closing the highly porous border. But it was the 4th Infantry Division that was facing the stiffest resistance. Its area of operations contained the Baathist heartland, and even as it deployed into the battle space, it began to make contact with both remnants of the regime and Iranian-backed militia groups. For the 4th ID, the mission in Iraq was, from its very inception, a combat operation. Its activities, which typically consisted of patrols and raids, were more aggressive than other units. There was far less shaking hands with local sheiks and far more storming suspected Baathist locations. It conducted numerous operations targeting Shia militias, which included arresting the Baquba police chief on suspicion of aiding the Badr. This was both an outcome of the culture of the division, which had entered the country with a very aggressive mindset, and the challenging area of operations it was confronting. As the summer progressed, 5th Corps headquarters attempted to synergize operations across the numerous divisional headquarters with limited success. Its HQ was so under-resourced that simply keeping up with the numerous different initiatives was problematic. They tried to implement some of the more successful innovations, but these were often only applicable to specific areas and situations. These challenges, and the effective decentralization of the war, with every division waging its own stabilization campaign, would persist across the theatre for a large portion of the conflict. Despite the ominous signs, throughout May, Coalition Command was still generally relaxed. Most of the looting had been brought under control and, generally speaking, the country seemed to be reasonably peaceful. Until early June, Coalition forces moved through Iraq's cities in an almost lackadaisical manner, operating in soft-skinned vehicles and only armed with pistols. Very little thought was given to force protection, especially when not operating in particularly dangerous areas in the Sunni Triangle or conducting raids or missions. This all changed when a young soldier was shot in the back of the head at point-blank range whilst he was buying DVDs at a roadside store in Baghdad. After that incident, all Coalition personnel were required to drive in 2-vehicle convoys and wear helmets and body armor at all times. This was a problematic order, as deployments to Iraq had been so rapid that there was not enough body armor to equip all Coalition forces. Only 40,000 of the 130,000 US personnel in Iraq had actually been issued a rifle plate, and many light infantry units lacked armored vehicles. By limiting friendly interactions with Coalition forces, this move to a more defensive posture, one which emphasized force protection over engagement, served to further alienate average Iraqis. Despite these protective measures, violent attacks on Coalition forces continued to escalate. Drive-by shootings, ambushes and RPG attacks on joint Coalition and police patrols were soon becoming a daily occurrence. In May, only 8 Coalition deaths were sustained due to hostile fire, but in June and July those numbers climbed to 24 and 28 respectively. 5th Corps Command assessed that the majority of these attacks were conducted by former regime security forces and paramilitaries that were thought to be reconstituting in Nineveh, but conducting attacks across Iraq. As most of these incidents had occurred in predominantly Sunni areas, it was concluded that Coalition policies were primarily to blame for the increase in violence. CPA Orders 1 and 2 had clearly led many Sunnis to believe that they would have no opportunities once the new Iraqi government assumed power. They were being frozen out of the Iraqi state. This was also the first realization that members of the former Iraqi security services were capable of orchestrating effective organized resistance, operations that combined Joint Special Operations Task Force Arabian Peninsula, labeled an insurgency, the first time that word was used to describe enemy activity in Iraq. Over and above former regime elements in the Sunni Triangle, the coalition was also facing a growing challenge from the Iranian-backed Badr Corps and Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. These Shia militia groups were actively waging very successful information operations in Najaf, spreading anti-coalition propaganda and attempting to install a shadow government in many Shia areas. It was believed that around 4,000 Badr Corps personnel were operating inside Iraq, But it wasn't just the coalition that was concerned by growing Iranian influence. All across southern Iraq, suspected Badr Corps headquarters were attacked by unidentified Iraqi militias. On May the 25th, a female suicide bomber targeted a Badr Corps facility in Baquba. CENTCOM attributed these activities to the followers of Muqtada al-Sadr, and it was clear that an intra-Shia conflict was already ongoing. Although Muqtada al-Sadr, a steadily growing political and military power within Iraq's Shia community, maintained a distinctly anti-coalition stance, he was just as wary of foreign Iranian influence. Either way, it was soon clear to American command that Iran was engaged in a very significant influence and destabilization operation within Iraq that clearly aimed to delegitimize both the coalition and the new Iraqi government. But it wasn't just the former regime and the Iranians that were causing trouble. Within weeks, the Islamist threat had also begun to raise its ugly head. With the removal of Saddam's oppressive regime, religious freedom flourished across Iraq, but with it rose religious extremism. Throughout May, many non-governmental agencies reported the widespread issuing of death threats to female teachers and young girls, which were aimed at deterring them from attending school. These were later attributed to both the Badr Corps and a shadowy group calling itself the Popular Committee for Punishment. Across many areas of Iraq, especially those where the coalition was unable to provide security, many women did not attend work or school for fear of violent attack. But the greatest concern to CENTCOM was the emergence of a virulently anti-coalition strain of Iraqi Salafism, where many imams and clerics gave sermons encouraging violent resistance to the occupation. Sunni Islamic fundamentalism, especially Salafism, was determined to be the one unifying factor linking all of the groups conducting violent protests and attacks across Anbar. There are also signs of the activity of a number of foreign Islamist and jihadi organizations. At least 2 had been detected establishing political parties which were attempting to seize power in areas of Iraq where the coalition had no military presence, and the Kurdish jihadi group Ansar al-Islam was thought to be reconstituting with the aid of al-Qaeda. By June, it was clear that all of these disparate insurgent factions were waging a highly effective information campaign, disseminating propaganda which emphasized the coalition's many failures, especially its inability to provide security for millions of average Iraqis. This was clearly striking a tone with average people, as one did not have to look far to see just how bad conditions were across most of Iraq's cities. Many were without basic government services or utilities, and local economic conditions were nearly catastrophic. Thus, it was probably the fertile ground in which these seeds were being sown, rather than the sophistication of the information operation itself, that led to its success. Coalition forces, on the other hand, were not conducting any such information campaign, and in fact were having trouble circulating news of their various successes. But it was clear that this was starting to get out of control. In May, coalition formations noticed extensive graffiti across Baghdad that criticized their ability to manage the situation, and by June, several local and international media outlets were openly advocating violent resistance to the occupation. These included a Baghdad radio station which broadcast anti-coalition propaganda and several newspapers. On June the 23rd, the CPA outlawed such activities and shut down the newspaper Nation's Echo in Najaf because it advocated violent resistance to the new government. But it was in the south where the first real signs of popular resistance were beginning to emerge. On the 24th of June, a patrol of the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment entered the town of Majar al-Kabir, 190 kilometers north of Basra in the province of Mayasan. Many of the locals had been outraged by CPA Order 3 and viewed their potential disarming by coalition forces as a near-death sentence in the dangerous post-invasion environment. These people had maintained their personal arms, including crew-served weapons such as PKMs, for decades. These arms were, they believed, the key to maintaining their own security from other tribal militias and non-state actors. Coalition searches had created an immense amount of resentment within the community, and the day before, British forces had signed a memorandum of understanding with the local people of the town, which stated that house searches would not be conducted. But when Bravo Company of the 1st Parachute Battalion arrived at the town intending to conduct a foot patrol, they were warned that the townspeople were infuriated and that they would be engaged if they entered Majar al-Kabir. Not wanting to show weakness, the Paras decided to conduct a vehicle patrol instead. As Bravo Company entered the town, they were pelted with rocks by a massive and angry crowd. Eventually, this became so severe that the Paras were forced to dismount and attempt to disperse the mob. At some point in the violent confrontation, local militia opened fire on the dismounted members of Bravo Company, and a significant contact ensued. Surrounded by a massive and angry mob, the Paras desperately tried to extricate themselves without massacring hundreds of civilians. As they withdrew, a small, 6-man detachment of Royal Military Police became isolated at the local police station. They had been deployed there as part of a training mission in support of the Iraqi police force. As the MPs dug in and tried to hold their ground, a murderous mob descended upon them. All were brutally killed and mutilated. The massacre of the MPs at Majar al-Kabir shook the British public and significantly changed British tactics. Despite their desire to operate more assertively, with the massive reaction of the Iraqi populace, it was decided that, in future, aggressive actions such as this should be conducted with more care and a greater emphasis on force protection. Despite the growing violence and resistance bubbling up across the country, Combined Joint Task Force 7 Command continued to assess former regime elements as the greatest cause of instability. Even in May and June, theatre headquarters was still primarily focused on destroying the remnants of Iraqi military units, and it was only in mid-June that the coalition began to really target the Baathist insurgency and Iranian proxies. This was a crystalline indication that Coalition Command was failing to grasp the complexity of post-Saddam Iraq. Nonetheless, it was clear that the Sunni triangle was becoming a nexus of resistance, and the porous western border allowed for an influx of foreign fighters and external support for Iraqi insurgent groups. In May, Combined Joint Task Force 7 conducted a corps-level operation targeting the Sunni triangle, an area between the cities of Tikrit, Ramadi, and Baghdad where the majority of Iraq's Sunni population resides. This offensive, which was codenamed Operation Desert Scorpion, was essentially a multi-division search and destroy mission designed to target Baathist elements and other insurgent groups such as Ansar al-Islam. After supporting operations by the 4th Infantry and 101st Airborne, the 3rd Infantry would make the operation's main effort. The offensive began on June 15, 2003. Several divisions executed simultaneous raids on locations in Fallujah, Habaniya, Ramadi, Hit, and Bakuba, and later continued those operations into Tikrit and Haditha. During the 2-week operation, coalition forces destroyed 1 training camp and killed or captured 400 Sunni insurgents and jihadis. Coalition Command viewed the operation as a significant success, although its long-term impact on the course of the insurgency was questionable. In July, the focus switched to more high-profile former regime targets. On the 22nd, the 101st Airborne received intelligence indicating that Saddam's sons, Uday and Qusay Hussein, were present in Mosul. An individual approached American soldiers who were manning a checkpoint. The Iraqi quickly revealed that, along with a bodyguard, Uday, Qusay, and his 14-year-old son Mustafa were staying at his house. The man had been a regime loyalist, and the 2 Husseins had demanded his aid. They had been living in Mosul for about 3 weeks. The man claimed he was in fear for his life, although the very significant reward may have had something to do with his change of heart. Uday and Qusay had returned from Syria, and Coalition Command believed that they were leading a good portion of the Baathist insurgency. At about 10 a.m, an 8-man Special Forces detachment of Task Force 121 and a platoon of infantry from the 101st Airborne approached the building, a large and opulent compound on the northern suburbs of the city. After the infantrymen surrounded the position, the operators approached and knocked on the front door. They were met there by the owner, who simply let them in. As the team moved into the compound and assaulted the second floor, they were met with heavy and accurate automatic fire. In the ensuing contact, 3 operators were wounded, and as they attempted to withdraw, a 4th was hit by small arms fire. The 4 men, Uday, Qusay, Mustafa, and their bodyguard, were all armed and had barricaded themselves on the second story of the compound. With the failure of the Special Forces assault, it was decided to simply let the grunts get to work. The infantrymen of the 3rd Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment, who had now taken up blocking positions around the building, began pouring heavy caliber fire into the second story, which included vehicle-mounted 50 caliber heavy machine guns, AT-4 light anti-tank weapons, and 40mm grenades. Despite the withering storm of lead and steel, the Husseins continued to put up resistance. The defenders had good lines of sight from the second story, and any movement in the open quickly drew their fire. This firefight continued for 3 hours before the Screaming Eagles decided to up the ante. Rather than assault the compound, they would simply flatten it. A Humvee with a vehicle-mounted BGM-71 TOW anti-tank missile system fired 10 weapons at the compound, blowing it to pieces room by room. After the bombardment, most of the house had been reduced to rubble. As the infantrymen approached the compound and initiated a search of the house, they found the bodies of Uday, Qusay, and their bodyguard. All had been apparently killed by the missile bombardment. As a fire team advanced up the stairs, Mustafa opened up on them with an AKM. In the resulting firefight, he, too, was killed. The deaths of Uday and Qusay Hussein, two of the most infamous members of the Baathist regime, appeared, at first, to deal a significant blow to a nascent insurgency. Although Saddam himself still remained at large, coalition leaders were confident that he would soon be either killed or captured. However, as would soon become all too apparent, the scale of the insurgency vastly transcended the former regime and its loyalists. During July and August 2003, the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force was rotated out of Iraq. It was replaced by the far less capable Polyglot International Division that was operating under Polish leadership. Called Multinational Division Central South, this formation was composed of numerous international detachments which ranged from brigade to company strength. Despite the fact that it was replacing the immensely powerful and heavily armed 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, at its deployment, the multinational division had a peak strength of just over 10,000 personnel. It contained contingents from 19 different countries. The largest contributor was Poland, who provided the headquarters group, 2 infantry battalions, an aviation battle group, engineer detachment, and other support capabilities. Both Ukraine and Spain deployed infantry-heavy brigades with troop strengths of 1,621 and 1,300 respectively. The rest ranged from a few hundred to a few dozen. One of the greatest limitations of Multinational Division Central South was the disunity of the formation. Each of the 19 contributing nations had their own rules of engagement. For example, the Poles and Ukrainians were permitted to conduct full combat missions, whilst many other contributors, such as Denmark and Italy, expected their forces to only conduct peacekeeping and stabilization tasks. Indeed, when given orders by Theatre Command, many national detachments would instead refer the matter up their own national chain of command for confirmation, authorization which would often not be forthcoming. This greatly limited the division's ability to actually conduct the various missions demanded of it. Given these weaknesses, it was decided to deploy this formation to what was thought to be a reasonably passive Shia area in the center of Iraq, where its tour of duty would hopefully be a peaceful one. But with the steadily deteriorating situation across the summer of 2003, Multinational Division Centre South's shortcomings began to matter more and more. The Polish division commander noted steady mission creep within his command. Rather than focusing on the kind of peacekeeping missions many had expected, his forces were engaged in both combat operations and large-scale humanitarian assistance and reconstruction efforts. In truth, he was under-resourced to conduct either of those mission sets. His division also lacked a robust intelligence element which could monitor the development of insurgent groups within his area of operations. Noting these issues, Colonel H.R. McMaster, General Abizaid's senior advisor at CENTCOM, recommended that the international attachments should be dispersed amongst the various American and British divisions where they could be allocated the less demanding tasks, such as guarding infrastructure. This would greatly mitigate the impact of political constraints on coalition operations and remove the intelligence and operations gap in central Iraq. These recommendations were, however, never implemented, which led to a significant lowering of the coalition's operational and intelligence footprint in the south. With the situation steadily deteriorating, both General Sanchez and General Abizaid decided to keep very significant US combat forces on the ground for a much longer period. Clearly, the very optimistic planning for Operation Iraqi Freedom, which envisaged the withdrawal of all major combat forces by late 2003, had been rendered moot by a disastrous set of decisions and policies implemented by the Coalition Provisional Authority. It was decided that the 101st Airborne Division, 4th Infantry Division, and 1st Armoured Division would remain in Iraq for a total of 12 months before redeploying. These forces were to conduct counterinsurgency and reconstruction operations, in addition to aiding the CPA in training the new Iraqi police force, Provincial Defence Force, and National Army. The next rotation of forces would occur in February and April 2004, and this time would include a large contingent of reserves. 2 National Guard enhanced separate brigades, North Carolina's 30th Infantry Brigade and the 39th Infantry Brigade from Arkansas, would deploy to Iraq, augmented by the 27th Infantry Brigade from New York and Oregon's 41st Infantry Brigade. The summer of 2003 had been, perhaps, the turning point in the Iraqi insurgency and the wider war. Through the abject neglect, negligence, and hubris of several powerful individuals within the Secretary of Defense's office, A golden opportunity had been squandered. The opening phase of Operation Iraqi Freedom had been a towering victory. In fact, the invasion of Iraq is one of the greatest successes in all of American military history. But by the stubborn application of a set of idealistic beliefs, especially on the capability of the American military and the nature of the political landscape in Iraq, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and Bremer not only robbed the coalition of any momentum it had gained through the invasion, they had implemented a set of policies that set Iraq on a path to insurgency and civil war. Now, it was the Iraqi people who were paying for these very poor decisions. But over and above the individual policy determinations, there were real problems with the whole approach to post-Saddam Iraq and Phase 4 operations. Bremer's appointment had been hasty to the point of recklessness, and the lack of consultation with anyone outside of the Secretary of Defense's office prior to his arrival was bound to lead the CPA to a set of policy decisions which were at odds with what the military was trying to achieve. Rumsfeld's frustration with McKiernan and Wallace, a complaint which is hard to understand given the US Army's performance during the invasion, and an eagerness to reduce the profile of the war in Iraq, led to the replacement of some of the Army's most experienced general officers by its most junior lieutenant general in command of an increasingly contentious and complicated theatre. Additionally, with the exception of General Abizaid, the operational and theatre-level general officers with the most expertise on Iraq had left the campaign. This brain drain led to a severe loss of momentum in the critical areas of campaign planning and strategy. The disjointed and haphazard application of tactics and operations across Iraq was the unavoidable result of these decisions. Throughout this critical period, CENTCOM struggled to gain resources for Iraq, as after President Bush's May 1st announcement that major combat operations were complete, many in Washington thought the war was over. This left an intellectually diminished Fifth Corps with far too few combat forces to secure the whole country, a situation made worse by Bremer's decision to disband the Iraqi army. The power, security, and governance vacuum which ensued, and the deteriorations of conditions across Iraq, proved to be a perfect opportunity for a number of domestic and international actors to make serious inroads in destabilizing the coalition. Several militias had achieved footholds across Iraq, many of whom conducted bloody reprisals unchecked, actions which only deepened Iraq's massive ethno-religious rivalries. Finally, the flat-footedness of the coalition in this critical period allowed several foreign jihadi organizations to exploit the nearly perfect conditions to turn Iraq into the world's primary battlefield between fundamentalist Islam and the West, a feat they were soon to achieve in the Sunni triangle. The failure of the military to effectively impose stability on Iraq was only compounded by the CPA's disastrous and hastily formulated policies which effectively dismantled the Iraqi state's most important institutions, including the security services and military. These policies were erroneously based on a historically inaccurate analogy between Baathist Iraq and Nazi Germany, and had the effect of ceding the initiative to the flourishing insurgent organizations, militias, and jihadis. Instead of the original post-invasion plan, which had been to simply remove the head of the Iraqi state and move to a transitory government, in a couple of weeks, Bremer and the CPA had dissolved the entire Iraqi security apparatus, and with it the foundation of the Iraqi state itself. This created a nationwide governance and security vacuum that would take another 7 years to fill. It was these decisions, along with failed reconstruction efforts, a lack of basic security, and unfulfilled popular expectations that would drive Iraq towards insurgency and full-blown civil war. As armed resistance to the occupation of Iraq grew in the summer of 2003, US leadership at both CENTCOM and Combined Joint Task Force 7 incorrectly assessed that the primary enemy they were facing was the Ba'ath Party, or more precisely, regime remnants whose support base rested in Iraq's Sunni minority. They also concluded that some of these attacks were the result of foreign terrorist organizations such as Ansar al-Islam. But this was a far too simplistic evaluation. Iraq is an extremely complex and diverse country, one with a deeply heterogeneous ethno-religious landscape. Adding to this complexity is the traditional nature of the Iraqi state, one in which these various tribal, ethnic, and religious groups possessed arms and acted in a semi-independent fashion. This had even been the case under Saddam's brutal rule, but with the massive power vacuum that the coalition victory had now created, each of these political entities became military actors within this extremely complex battle space. All three of Iraq's dominant ethno-religious factions, the Sunnis, Shia, and Kurds, had pre-existing militias and militant groups who could act to further their own political interest, and the removal of the Baathist regime and its replacement by a severely undermanned coalition military had given them all a unique opportunity to gain influence, power, and territory. Adding fuel to this fire was the influence of several of Iraq's neighbours, who also entered this vacuum to further their own interests, objectives which often ran counter to the coalitions. Although Iran was clearly the greatest threat, this even included US allies like Turkey. It was these conflicting interests, much more so than the kind of nationalist insurgency encountered in South Vietnam, that would inflict such violence, death, and destruction upon Iraq. The most obvious source of instability and resistance to the coalition rested in Iraq's Sunni population. Intrinsic to Saddam's rule was a Sunni domination of Iraqi society, and it was here that he maintained his power base. Much of Sunni Iraq supported the Baathists because of this preferential treatment and fear of the Shia. Furthermore, Saddam had been aided by the other Sunni powers of the region in his decade-long war with Shia Iran, and, generally speaking, Baathist Iraq viewed its Shia majority as an avenue for Iranian influence and resistance. Therefore, it was logical that with the toppling of the Baathist regime by the coalition, its remnants would find support within the Sunni triangle. But this was a far too simplistic conception of the views of Sunni Iraq as a whole. Whilst it was certainly true that many Sunnis resented the toppling of the regime, and with it their privileged status within Iraqi society, this was certainly not the case for all. Saddam had not only privileged the Sunnis of Iraq, he had also relied upon his own tribe and others he favoured to buttress his base of support. Several key positions within the government, including the Ministers of Defence, the Military Bureau, and the National Security Bureau, some of the most influential positions within the regime, were given to members of his own tribe or those he favoured in the Anbar, Nineveh, and Saladin provinces. He also heavily recruited in these areas for service in the armed forces, especially the elite Republican Guard, linking the wider military to this vast network of tribal patronage. During the interbellum years, when Iraq was heavily sanctioned, Saddam granted these tribal leaders a large degree of autonomy, allowing them to both administer justice and profit in illegal activities such as smuggling. Thus, in the opening stages of the occupation, there was a lot of goodwill amongst these disenfranchised Sunni tribes who had not been favoured by Saddam. When the regime fell in the first week of April, much of the Sunni areas of Iraq, such as Anbar, Saladin, Nineveh, and parts of Tamim, had not seen any coalition presence or battle. The local Sunni militias had not yet encountered coalition forces, and thus many Sunni tribal leaders had concluded that the war had been lost due to Saddam's incompetence. They had never been defeated. When the coalition eventually extended its footprint into these regions to accept the surrender of the remaining security forces, these Sunni tribal sheikhs waited for the Americans to approach them. After meeting with coalition officers during the summer months, General Sanchez was surprised by the attitudes and expectations of many Sunni tribal leaders. Most of these sheikhs incorrectly believed that Iraq was a Sunni majority country, and that the Shia were incapable of governing. They also viewed themselves as natural American allies, as both were bitter enemies of Shia Iran. Therefore, they expected to receive privileged status in the new Iraqi government, much like the patronage system under Saddam. This period of goodwill did not persist for long, however. The combination of CPA Orders 1 and 2, especially Bremer's radical de-Baathification plan, and the coalition's outreach to Shia leaders in the formulation of the interim government quickly disabused Sunni tribal leadership of these beliefs. Within weeks, all of Sunni Iraq had turned against the coalition. Most of the Sunni tribes were also seriously overconfident in their ability to defeat both the coalition and their internal enemies. This perceived military superiority, one founded upon a history of Sunni domination of Iraq, led to a belief that once they had defeated both the Kurds and the Shia in battle, the coalition would have no choice but to work exclusively with the Sunnis to form the new government. Sunni sheikhs were confident that their network of tribal ties, kinship, and military experience, proven martial prowess they had displayed in battle, would eventually restore them to a position of power within Iraq. In order to fulfill these lofty ambitions, they first had to violently eject the coalition from the Sunni areas, and began working with other Sunni resistance movements and international terrorist organizations to achieve this aim. Before most of the Sunni tribes turned against the coalition, US intelligence assessed that the majority of the insurgent activity being encountered originated from organized regime remnants. In the wake of the invasion, many of the regime's highest-ranking members had fled and were in exile. The most important of these figures was Saddam's deputy, Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri, who had fled to Syria with most of the regime's funds. Al-Duri was very well positioned to lead the Baathist insurgency. One of Saddam's most trusted lieutenants, through his decades of leadership within the regime, Duri had cultivated numerous contacts with elements of Iraqi intelligence, former security services, the military, and even Sunni and Sufi tribal and religious leaders, with whom he had established relationships during Saddam's faith campaign of the 1990s. Duri had also served as the commander of Iraq's northern military zone, an area where many of his supporters lived, which included direct command over the Republican Guard divisions deployed there. Therefore, this extremely influential individual, one who had established a very high profile within the regime and developed a network of connections throughout the most important elements of the former Iraqi security services, was, within weeks, able to deploy organized resistance to the coalition. The complete dissolution of the Iraqi military only swelled al-Duri's ranks. Because Duri's command laid in the north of the country, when the invasion began in March and April, he was able to maintain the core of his support apparatus. With the closure of the Turkish invasion route, the only coalition forces in Iraq's north had been special forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga. Consequently, Duri's command escaped the mauling experienced by the Medina Division and other Republican Guard formations that were unlucky enough to encounter US heavy forces. Thus, unlike the Republican Guard divisions deployed in the south, he was able to escape with the majority of his headquarters staff at the division and corps level, most of whom remained loyal. These were well-trained and highly experienced officers, providing Duri with a capability in exile that set him apart from other Baathists. Unbeknownst to the coalition, with the collapse of the regime, al-Duri's networks went underground and awaited his orders. He attempted to establish a government in exile with the backing of the Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad, although this led to the subordination of the Iraqi Baathists to the Syrian wing of the party. Organized Baathist resistance was also being directed from within Iraq, including by Saddam himself. An organization called Jaish-Muhammad, or the Army of Muhammad, had been founded by the regime and funded by large elements of currency which had been withdrawn from Iraq's central bank by Uday Hussein. Saddam directed this group from his hiding place at Ad-Dawr. Its objective was to restore the former regime to power. Composed of former military personnel and tribal groups with links to Saddam, within weeks 4 cells or battalions had been formed and were operating across the Sunni Triangle. The Adwa or Return Battalion was composed of Baathist civilians. The Fedayeen Battalion was, as the name implies, formed by members of the Fedayeen Saddam. The Army Forces Battalion was composed of former military personnel, and finally the Mujahideen Battalion, which was manned by foreign fighters. Jaish-Muhammad's access to existing Baathist networks, military units, militias, political leadership and funding allowed it to grow rapidly, and before long it had developed contacts in Syria, allowing for the external purchase of materiel and supplies and the use of Syrian territory as a safe haven. As the organization grew, it maintained a disciplined cell structure based on the hierarchy of the former Baath party, and even developed a sophisticated propaganda and information operations apparatus across both print media and television. Eventually, Jaish-Muhammad expanded its insurgent activities from the Sunni stronghold of Anbar to Nineveh, Salahuddin, Tamim, Diyala, and Baghdad. Jaish-Muhammad was led by Muhammad Yunus al-Ahmad, a prominent Baathist who was unknown to the coalition. Al-Ahmad would grow to challenge al-Duri for the position of Saddam's legitimate successor, eventually leading to a schism in the Baathist insurgency. But perhaps the greatest Baathist threat to immediately emerge was, ironically enough, Islamist. Through an unholy union of the secular, pan-Arab socialist Baathist and Salafi jihadists, two ideologies that were, at base, diametrically opposed, perhaps the most formidable Baathist insurgent organizations were to emerge. The first of these was originally based on many of the tribal contacts developed under Saddam. Called Jaish al-Islami, or the Islamic Army of Iraq, this organization was founded by former Iraqi military intelligence colonel Muhammad Kazim al-Janabi. Its stated objective was to force the coalition to depart Iraq and then establish a Sunni government guided by Sharia law. This toxic combination of Iraqi intelligence and religious fundamentalism was a direct result of Saddam's Islamization campaign of the 1990s. Although Jaish al-Islami received the blessing and support of al-Duri, it was not aiming to restore the old regime per se. Its members were drawn from the Janabi, Uday, and Zobai tribes and saw themselves as the institutional continuation of the Iraqi military. Jaish al-Islami conducted a traditional guerrilla campaign against the coalition military, new Iraqi army and Iraqi police. Through its relationship with the Fallujah-based Mujahideen Shura, or Council, led by the Sufi Sheikh Abdullah Janabi, Jaish al-Islami was able to make contact with several Salafi jihadist figures and organizations, including Zarqawi, which significantly influenced its structure and tactics. Eventually, the organization was bolstered by the influx of foreign fighters such as Iraqi Afghans who had been fighting with the regime during the invasion. Indeed, the Islamist insurgency grew to represent an ever-increasing source of violent resistance to the coalition. With the rise in Salafi ideology, which had begun under Saddam's faith campaign, and the dissolution of the traditional Iraqi state which followed the fall of the regime, resistance to the coalition founded upon religious principles, as opposed to nationalism, grew in importance across large areas of the Sunni triangle. This process was aided by the Islamic Research Center of Al-Azhar University in Egypt's March pronouncement legitimizing all violent attacks on the coalition as jihad. This development greatly aided Ansar al-Islam. The organization had been badly mauled by US Special Forces in March and April, losing its training camps and most of its veteran fighters across several battles in Kurdistan. However, its remnants were able to escape to the Sunni Triangle, where they not only found a sympathetic population, but were able to make contacts with other jihadist groups such as Al-Qaeda. With Al-Qaeda's influence, Ansar al-Islam adopted a rigid cell structure. Each of these groups contained 10 to 15 members and was led by an emir or commander. This structure made the organization very difficult to disrupt, as each cell was completely unaware of the others or the structure of the group as a whole. In June, Ansar al-Islam's military chief, Abu Abdullah al-Shaf, formed a new wing of the organization that took it beyond its Kurdish roots. Much like Al-Qaeda had done internationally, al-Shaf aimed to form an umbrella organization which could unite all of Iraq's Sunni Islamist groups. As it grew in capability, the new Ansar al-Islam also began to emulate Al-Qaeda's tactics. In June, it announced that 300 of its members had agreed to martyr themselves. The use of suicide bombings was an innovation for the organization, as this tactic had never been employed during its time in Iraqi Kurdistan. Throughout this period, Zarqawi had been biding his time and formulating a strategy for the coming war. One of the key differences of opinion that had always separated Zarqawi from bin Laden was the former's rabid sectarianism. Even now, as he operated in an Iraq which had been conquered by the Americans, he remained squarely focused on the country's Shia majority. Zarqawi had always viewed the Shia as the primary threat to Sunni rule in Iraq, and indeed all of Sunni Islam. In a distinct difference from bin Laden's wider ideology and worldview, the prospect of massacring scores of innocent Muslims gave the Jordanian no pause. Zarqawi's strategy was as ruthless as it was effective. Rather than striking the coalition military, his plan was to target both Iraq's Shia and major international organizations such as the UN with mass casualty terrorist attacks. These operations aimed to delegitimize the new Iraqi government, erode international support for the US occupation, and ultimately ignite a full-blown sectarian civil war, a conflict in which he was sure the Sunni would prevail. Zarqawi had spent months building his organization, establishing a training camp in Anbar and relocating his base of support to Fallujah, which was soon becoming the epicenter of the Islamist insurgency. Despite the relatively small size of Tawhid wal Jihad in March, just 3 months later it had grown significantly. As one of the more experienced and capable Salafi jihadist organizations within Iraq, one led by a charismatic zealot, Zarqawi's group soon attracted many of the foreign fighters that had resisted the invasion. By August, he was ready to join battle with the coalition. Unlike some of the insurgent organizations, which waged a more traditional style of guerrilla warfare, Zarqawi's goal was instilling fear and rage in his opponents. His archetype was much more the traditional terrorist who aimed to leverage violence and fear to generate a political and, potentially, a military response from his enemies. Rather than engaging coalition military forces, he preferred spectacular mass casualty terrorist attacks targeting civilians. Although the improvised explosive device was already causing the coalition significant problems, Zarqawi preferred his IEDs to be delivered by a human being, something much harder to stop. In August 2003, Zarqawi began this campaign in earnest. On the 7th, a man parked a minivan in front of the Jordanian embassy in Baghdad. It was packed full of explosives. When it detonated, the blast was so powerful that a nearby car landed on the roof of a building. The embassy was obliterated by the explosion, killing 17 and wounding 40 in the process. The remnants of the compound was later ransacked by a mob of Iraqis chanting anti-Jordanian slogans. This was the worst attack of the war to that date, one with a symbolic significance that was clearly meaningful to Zarqawi, but it was only the beginning. Less than 2 weeks later, on the 19th, Zarqawi executed an even more spectacular attack. The United Nations Assistance Mission in Iraq, the UN's mission to support the newly formed Iraqi government, was headquartered in the multi-story Canal Hotel in downtown Baghdad. Unlike the other major headquarters, this location was not within the heavily fortified Green Zone. In fact, the UN members were proud that regular Iraqis could approach their headquarters with only minimum security. That day, a man drove a truck right up to the front of the hotel. It was carrying a number of ex-military munitions, including a 500-pound air-dropped bomb taken from an Iraqi Air Force munitions bunker. The massive blast leveled the hotel, taking the lives of 22 people, including Sergio Vieira de Mello, the UN's special representative in Iraq. After Zarqawi attacked the hotel again a month later, the UN removed its entire footprint from Baghdad. This was undeniably a very significant success, as with just 2 attacks, Zarqawi had not only substantially altered international conceptions of the war, but had seriously eroded international support for the US occupation. Zarqawi's August operation did not end there, however. On the morning of the 29th of August, a large group of Shia gathered around the holy Imam Ali Mosque in Najaf for morning prayers. Amongst them was Ayatollah Muhammad Baqir al-Hakim, a revered Shia Islamic scholar and the spiritual leader of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq. As the masses prayed, 2 cars approached the mosque, one driven by Zarqawi's father-in-law, Yassin al-Jarrad. Both were filled with explosives. The murderous effect these weapons had amongst the dense crowd was horrifying. 95 people were killed and almost 500 were wounded. Amongst them was Ayatollah Muhammad Baqir al-Hakim. This was the deadliest terrorist attack Iraq experienced in 2003, one that shook the nation to its very core. In its aftermath, thousands of enraged Shia roamed the streets demanding vengeance, and Iraq took one more step along the path to civil war. The abrupt and dramatic deterioration of the security situation in June and August, especially the shift in tactics being employed by various insurgent organizations, generated immense concern at CENTCOM, 5th Corps headquarters, and in Washington. In May, the theater-wide total of all enemy contacts, including any incident involving coalition personnel, was 160. In June, it was 300. By August, it had ballooned to 500. This level of intensity persisted throughout the next 12 months, reaching over 600 in May 2004, or nearly 20 per day, an indication of how quickly the Iraqi insurgency metastasized. Over 90% of these attacks occurred in the Sunni axis of Baghdad, Salahuddin, Anbar, Diyala, Nineveh, and Babel, areas with either Sunni majorities or a large Sunni minority. These incidents span the full spectrum of insurgent and guerrilla tactics, from opportunistic ambushes and organized firefights to harassing sniper fire, drive-by shootings, and RPG attacks. Beginning in July, Coalition Command noted the sharp increase in mortar attacks on coalition bases and forces. These contacts eventually evolved from more or less random actions to well-organized strikes on supply convoys, checkpoints, non-government organizations, and more vulnerable and exposed forward operating bases. Some of these groups, which could have also included organized crime, were using kidnapping of local Iraqis to finance their operations. During the summer of 2003, many insurgent organizations began to perfect the use of roadside bombs, or IEDs. The massive amount of explosives available in the country, including huge stockpiles of artillery shells which had been abandoned by the Iraqi army, and the low level of expertise required to construct and employ them, soon made the improvised explosive device the insurgents' preferred weapon. Often, all that was required was some kind of explosive munition, like an artillery shell, a detonator, and some wire. This level of technological sophistication was well within the reach of virtually all of Iraq's insurgent organizations. This method of delivery, planting an artillery shell on the side of the road and simply waiting for a coalition convoy to drive by before manually detonating it, negated most of the technological advantages held by the US military. Trying to fire a shell at an American formation from, say, a T-72's 125mm main gun would usually lead an Iraqi platform to a very rapid demise, as the coalition's overwhelming advantage in ISR and precision fires made this kind of conventional engagement a death sentence for most Iraqi forces. But anyone, even a civilian, could, under the cover of darkness, quietly bury a 43-kilogram, 152mm artillery shell on the side of the road and simply wait for the target to come to the projectile. Despite their pervasive ISR footprint, in a bustling Middle Eastern city like Baghdad, or in the hamlets and small villages of rural Iraq, detecting and disrupting this kind of activity was extremely difficult. IED attacks began sporadically in late April, and then steadily increased in frequency for the rest of the year. Between August and December 2003, coalition forces were facing an average of 20 successful IED attacks per day. This was unquestionably the insurgents' most effective weapon. Ambushes and firefights with coalition formations, which were more heavily armed and technically skilled than the local militias, typically did not end well for the insurgents. But the IEDs were another story altogether. By early 2004, 54% of all coalition casualties were due to these devices. Unsurprisingly, the rapid emergence of the Iraqi insurgency became a highly sensitive political issue in Washington. President Bush himself had all but declared the war over, and Secretary Rumsfeld continued to advance a narrative which foresaw an easy transition to Iraqi governance and a rapid American withdrawal. Both had invested significant political stock in building this wider conception of the war amongst the American public. In Rumsfeld's Brave New World, the revolution in military affairs and American technological dominance had made Washington's wars quick and cheap. As had already been described, in both public and private settings, the Secretary of Defense continued to push for smaller troop footprints and shorter deployment timelines. The foolishness of these decisions was now beginning to manifest on the streets of Baghdad, and millions of average citizens across the Western world watched Iraq's descent into chaos live on cable news. This political dynamic soon began to influence how coalition theatre commanders planned and even characterized the evolving campaign in Iraq. Until July, General Abizaid felt as though he could not use the term insurgent to describe the new enemy in Iraq. After all, General Wallace had essentially been fired for simply characterizing the Fedayeen Saddam and other paramilitary forces in a manner which angered Rumsfeld. Thus, when Abizaid publicly used the term insurgency on July the 15th, he immediately drew the Secretary's ire. However, this was much more than simply a question of semantics and domestic political messaging. Properly characterizing the nature of the campaign the coalition was now waging was the first step in developing a strategy to win it. Therefore, convincing Rumsfeld to face reality and accept that the United States was back in the painful business of counterinsurgency was the first battle Abizaid had to wage. In a July memorandum between Abizaid and Rumsfeld, the general assessed that the main threats facing the coalition emanated from regime remnants and the Islamists, both of which found a fertile support base in the disenfranchised and highly religious Sunni. Abizaid continued, "The potential recruits are disaffected mainly because they perceive a lack of progress in economic development and political reform. They are facing loss of livelihood, are frustrated by a lack of security and basic services, have the perception that they are losers due to the termination of Saddam-era patronage and de-Baathification, have strong nationalist feelings, feel humiliated by the rapid coalition military victory over Iraqi armed forces, and are suspicious of coalition motivations for liberating Iraq as well as coalition designs for the future." In response to these challenges, the general outlined a set of policies which he believed could have a positive effect. A reorganization of the Coalition Provisional Authority, which would expand its influence beyond Baghdad, a comprehensive strategic communications or information operations campaign, programs for economic development, the strengthening of political and judicial systems, and, finally, an effort to gain international support for the reconstruction effort. Thus, without using the politically inflammatory word insurgent, Abizaid had essentially described the roots of the Iraqi insurgency and outlined a credible coalition counterinsurgency campaign. Although CENTCOM had some understanding of the enemy it was now facing, Combined Joint Task Force 7, or 5th Corps headquarters, were not adapting as easily to the dramatically different operational environment. The prior 20 years of doctrinal development had shaped the United States Army into an organization which had a razor-sharp focus on engaging peer adversaries, and in the process had made it one of the most proficient exponents of maneuver warfare in military history. In the early 2000s, American doctrine had deep roots in the Cold War. Air-land battle was a revolutionary concept within the US military, one which had essentially rejected attrition as the foundational principle which underpinned the American way of war, a concept which dated back to the Civil War and the Overland Campaign. Although it was a doctrinal paradigm which was designed to defeat the numerically superior Soviet military in a conventional campaign, it was perhaps the most important innovation that led to the crushing victory in Operation Desert Storm. Although the wider paradigm had evolved substantially by 2003, our land battle was still the foundational framework US officers applied to contemporary conflict. However, the military it had shaped was not well suited to the rapidly evolving situation in Iraq. Virtually all of the staff officers at 5th Corps headquarters had been trained to focus on large, conventional land formations which could be displayed on a digital battle map. But when the 5th Corps encountered non-conventional forces during the invasion, such as the Fedayeen Saddam, the staff struggled to evaluate and depict these formations appropriately. Thus, when the Iraqi insurgency developed, 5th Corps HQ faced entirely similar challenges, a problem made worse when it abruptly became a theatre headquarters. Staff officers continued to portray the enemy in terms of large formations such as battalions, a paradigm which was a poor fit for the intricate, interwoven and amorphous network of political and tribal militias, regime remnants, former military organizations and jihadis that formed a patchwork which overlaid all of the hostile activity in the theatre. Colonel Derek Harvey, an intelligence officer whom CENTCOM sent to assist Combined Joint Task Force 7, later recalled, "One thing that always frustrated me was the idea that, unless you could lay out a military-style hierarchy of command and control, a bad organization didn't exist." In truth, the United States Army of the late Cold War was an organization that had a cultural aversion to counterinsurgency, one born out of the institutional memory of the jungles of South Vietnam and the horror they contained. It took all too well to the new task of high-end conventional warfare, but in the process, its doctrinal development and training paradigms had badly neglected counterinsurgency, operations that demanded a very different set of skills. This deficiency was clearly manifesting at both 5th Corps headquarters and across the force as a whole. The US military was accustomed to detecting enemy activity by monitoring large-scale camps, equipment, and formations, or by intercepting the kind of digital communications used by Al-Qaeda and other global jihadist networks. None of these were applicable to the Iraqi insurgency, one that relied upon tribal and other informal networks which emerged after the fall of the regime. These required the development of human intelligence, and whilst at the division level and below many units began trying to generate human sources, in 2003 they tended to lack the experience, analytical skills, and interpreters necessary for the task. It would take months of trial and error, and the introduction of additional personnel and systems focused on human intelligence, network-based analysis, and cultural analysis before Combined Joint Task Force 7 would gain much traction in understanding the true source and nature of the resistance in Iraq. As the Sunni insurgency exploded across Anbar, Diyala, Saladin, Nineveh, and Baghdad, in the south, the Shia were far more focused on their internal enemies. Shia militias largely spent the summer of 2003 fighting each other, with only minor breaks to attack coalition forces or conduct reprisals against the Sunni. Unlike the Sunni, whose diverse and amorphous actors and groups were united by the common cause of ejecting the coalition and re-establishing Sunni dominance over Iraq, the Shia were far more divided. The collapse of the regime had generated a power vacuum that 4 major Shia factions vied to fill. The most organised and well-funded was the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which before his death at the hands of Zarqawi was led by Ayatollah Muhammad Baqir al-Hakim and his younger brother Abdul Aziz al-Hakim. This organisation was affiliated with the already described Badr Corps militia. Despite its advantages, many Iraqis distrusted the Supreme Council because of its ties to Iran. It was the Shia religious community, or Hawza, in Najaf and Karbala that actually wielded more influence than the Supreme Council. Nevertheless, the leadership of Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani was cautious, and thus, despite its wide base of support, this faction had not significantly impacted events. The third faction was led by a number of Iraqi expatriates, including Ahmad Jalabi and Ayad Alawi, individuals who had fled Iraq and led an anti-Baathist resistance from abroad. The fourth force was composed of a number of prominent religious families, Muqtada al-Sadr among them, who remained in Iraq during Saddam's purges. The April murder of Ayatollah Abdul Majid al-Khoi by the Sadrists and the death of Ayatollah Muhammad Baqir al-Hakim in August only served to deepen the divisions between these factions, effectively ending any hopes that the competition between them could be resolved by a political process alone. For years, the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq had been the focal point of Shia resistance to Baathist rule, dating right back to the Iran-Iraq War. Its affiliates, the Baathist and Islamist Dawa Party, had both been trained and funded by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran. Indeed, the Baathist had originally been formed by Iraqi prisoners of war and deserters. Throughout the summer, its activities had primarily focused on reprisal attacks against former elements of the regime. For example, this activity included systematic assassinations of former Iraqi Air Force pilots. The Baathist was already on the coalition's radar, and some of this activity had been detected by the 4th Infantry Division. But the growing political influence of the Supreme Council and a desire to avoid provoking the Shia hindered the coalition's ability to do more. The Baathist was an organization which was well prepared for the insurgency. It had been operational within Iraq for several years. In 1999, 4 geographical commands had been established, each of which had been conducting anti-regime activities. This experience, and its Iranian backing, would make it an increasingly dangerous opponent for coalition forces as the insurgency developed. However, with the death of Mohammed Bakr al-Hakim in August, the Supreme Council was a politically weakened organization. Not only was it now unable to exert control over its military affiliates such as the Baathist, which now began attacking the coalition, but with the removal of the most prominent Shia political figure, the door was now open for the others. This process was only accelerated when Abdul Aziz al-Hakim, Mohammed Bakr al-Hakim's brother and successor, announced in August that Iraq should pay Iran $100 billion in war reparations, hardly a wise political move coming from an Iranian-sponsored expatriate party. For the preceding half-century, Iraq's Shia religious community had been dominated by 3 great families: the Saddams, the Hakims, and the Qusays. Each of these families had large popular followings, and competition between them had often spilled over into violence. For years, the main rival of Mohammed Bakr al-Hakim, the religious leader of the Supreme Council, was Muqtada al-Sadr's father. Thus, when the regime fell, this competition quickly reignited into a violent power struggle between Mohammed al-Hakim and Muqtada al-Sadr. Right before his death, Hakim was aggressively deploying Baathist elements throughout Najaf, prompting the local elements to hastily establish their own militias to prevent the complete loss of the city. During this period, Sadr was establishing his power base in Sadr City, a Baghdad suburb and Shia slum once known as Saddam City. There he raised his own militia, known to the coalition as the Mahdi Army, which soon grew rapidly. By August, the Sadrists were one of the largest military forces within Shia Iraq. Although he lacked the religious credentials of his father and grandfather, Muqtada al-Sadr was a naturally gifted politician. He was able to position himself as an independent Iraqi between the Iranian-backed Supreme Council and American-backed Provisional Government, advancing a nationalist message that resonated with many Iraqis. Scores of young men flocked to join the Mahdi Army. However, unlike the Sunni resistance organizations, most of these were uneducated Shia who the Baathists had repressed. Few had served in Saddam's army, and thus their military experience or expertise was minimal. And, as Muqtada al-Sadr had denounced the Iranians, he could not rely upon the IRGC for training and material support, as the Baathist did. Nevertheless, with so many men joining his ranks, eventually some capable military leaders emerged. By the late summer, training camps had been established across southern Iraq, and Mahdi army companies and battalions were being formed. Now, with an army at his back, Sadr felt strong enough to use his Friday sermons at the Great Mosque in Kufa, where he had established his headquarters, to mobilize popular support against the coalition. In the northern provinces of Iraq, the other major ethno-religious faction, the Kurds, were nominally US allies. In fact, the entire north of the country had been purged of Baathist forces with little more than coalition special forces and the Kurdish Peshmerga. Despite the friendly relations between the Kurds and the coalition, there were still sources of friction between the two. Just like every other Iraqi faction, the Kurds' ultimate aim was to further their own interest, and often these ran counter to the Coalition Provisional Authorities, which was trying to fuse together a crumbling Iraqi state. Ever since the imposition of the no-fly zone in 1993, Iraqi Kurdistan had enjoyed a very significant position of autonomy within Baathist Iraq, and with the departure of Saddam, there was no way they were going to relinquish that independence. But with the existence of this state within a state, the desire to increase their own influence and power drove Kurdish leadership towards more aggressive and expansionist policies. Ultimately, they wished to extend their internal borders to include several strategically vital locations, including the major northern population center of Mosul. but their most critical objective was Kirkuk. For cultural reasons, the Kurds viewed Kirkuk as the natural capital city of Kurdistan, and its surrounding oil fields would provide them with both increased funds and influence within the new Iraqi state. As they moved to expand their influence, this immediately generated increasing friction with the local Sunni Arab population, who had traditionally viewed the Kurds as their local enemies. The outbreak of civil war between the two was certainly not in the coalition's interest. Additionally, and although this went largely unknown to Fifth Corps headquarters, Kurdish intelligence was conducting their own reprisals against former members of the Baathist regime. This included assassinations as far south as Baghdad. These actions only served to deepen the resentment of the Sunni Arabs and fuel the anti-coalition insurgency. Over and above these internal factions, several external powers had a significant influence on the development of the Iraqi insurgency. The Turks, a NATO ally, viewed American moves in Iraq with suspicion. Ankara greatly feared the establishment of an independent Kurdistan, one that could cause the Kurdish areas of Anatolia to secede. The Turks also feared that Washington would use its Kurdish allies to exert significant leverage over them. Thus, they began arming and training Turkoman communities in northern Iraq, adding another military actor in the region that could give the Turks influence within Iraqi politics and counter Kurdish ambitions around Mosul. The Syrians, however, played a much more direct role in fostering the Sunni insurgency. Although hardly a close ally of Saddam, Bashar al-Assad's Baathist regime was certainly no friend of the United States, and whilst Damascus did not want to provoke a US military intervention by openly entering the war, the fall of the regime and ensuing insurgency represented a golden opportunity to undermine Washington's wider position within the region. Thus, Assad secretly established links with numerous jihadi and Arab mujahideen groups, including al-Qaeda, allowing them safe passage to Iraq. As former Syrian governor of Deir ez-Zor province, Nawaf Faris revealed in 2012, these individuals were not only granted safe passage, but their transport and insertion was facilitated by the regime. Syria also acted as a safe haven for the remaining Baathist groups, providing them with infrastructure and funding. As a result, a steady flow of insurgents, money, and materiel transited the Syrian border and made its way to the Sunni Triangle. As much as the Sunni insurgency was supported by the Syrians, it was the Iranians who had the most at stake in Iraq. The leadership of the Islamic Republic had long believed that the survival of their regime was intertwined with Iraq's future. The two nations had fought a decade-long war in which both the Arab and Western worlds had supported their arch-enemy, Saddam Hussein. This was a war of national survival, and the Islamic Republic had long seen itself as a regime under siege. The departure of Saddam and the dissolution of the Sunni Baathists was a welcome event. However, Tehran was concerned that a democratic Iraq, governed by a Shia majority, would threaten the legitimacy of their rule at home. Thus, the Iranians had a direct stake in the war, although like the Syrians, they had no wish to openly engage the coalition military. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was very well equipped, both materially and through years of experience in developing Iranian proxies, to exert significant influence in Iraq. Through its relationships with various Shia militias, including the Badr Corps and, eventually, Mahdi Army, Tehran was able to wage a very effective proxy war with the United States on the streets of Baghdad. As the summer of 2003 ended, it was clear that the post-Saddam environment coalition forces had generated through their impressive conventional victories in March and April was not what the neoconservative elements within the Bush administration had envisaged. As opposed to post-Hitler Germany, a culturally, ethnically, and religiously homogenous society which had been thoroughly defeated in 6 years of conventional war, one which was surrounded by hostile powers which all had a vested interest in preventing the re-emergence of Nazism, post-Saddam Iraq was an ethno-religious tinderbox just waiting for a match. The various sectarian and ethnic groups viewed each other with greater fear and suspicion than they did the occupying coalition forces, and these fissures drove the state itself towards violent fragmentation. By treating Baathism as an analogous political ideology to Nazism, as opposed to engineering a more enlightened Iraqi political culture, Rumsfeld and Bremer had simply disenfranchised one of Iraq's largest and most powerful factions, the Sunni Arabs, a group which had the support of the global Salafi jihadist community. The situation on the ground was far more complex and challenging than Rumsfeld or Wolfowitz had argued or believed. Even as the coalition had gotten itself embroiled in a quagmire of sectarian, ethnic, and tribal rivalries, all within one of the most heavily armed societies in the world, those same political leaders were demanding a smaller coalition footprint. But with the emergence of the Iraqi insurgency across the summer of 2003, that optimistic view was rapidly becoming a fantasy. The situation in the Sunni triangle was even worse than Generals Abizaid and Sanchez realized. Tribal disenfranchisement, the re-emergence of Sunni religious fundamentalism and Syrian support for former regime elements rapidly fueled the Sunni insurgency, and international jihadi organizations such as Al-Qaeda, Jamaat al-Tawhid wal-Jihad and Ansar al-Islam were able to exploit the same networks to well and truly establish themselves there. The Sunni insurgency arose across an area of battle space which was, at the time, only exposed to the thinnest of a coalition presence, allowing these organizations a freedom of maneuver that could, if permitted unchecked, allow these groups to eventually challenge the coalition in more conventional engagements. Coalition Command understood that the insurgency was primarily a Sunni phenomenon. However, this led them to the false belief that the Shia areas were generally peaceful and receptive to a new Iraqi government. Additionally, with insufficient resources to manage the situation in the Sunni triangle, General Sanchez and Abizaid had no wish to provoke the Saddamists. By the time Coalition Command had realized their mistake, the Badr Corps and Mahdi army had spent months preparing for war, training their forces, stockpiling munitions, and slowly expanding their control of vital territory. Coalition political and military leadership was slow to realize the danger posed by all of these factions. Throughout the first 6 months of the occupation, the coalition believed they were facing a traditional insurgency being waged by regime remnants and jihadis, rather than a brewing civil war. With the deteriorating security situation across Iraq, pressure began to mount on both the Coalition Provisional Authority and Combined Joint Task Force 7 to produce a strategy to stabilize Iraq, reduce the coalition footprint, and transfer sovereignty and responsibility for security to the new Iraqi government and military. In July, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Richard Mayers, ordered General Tommy Franks to work with the Coalition Provisional Authority to produce an integrated strategic campaign plan for stability and support operations in Iraq. This campaign plan was to be presented to the Secretary of Defense and Joint Chiefs on July the 23rd. Franks retired 4 days later. His replacement, General Abizaid, barely had enough time to do anything other than manage both the command transition and operational tasks in the theatre, and thus did not even start writing said campaign plan until mid-August. Ambassador Bremer presented a 57-page document called The Strategic Plan and Vision for Iraq. Although reasonably comprehensive, the CPA's campaign plan was more of a list of tasks than a viable strategy, and included overly optimistic assessments and timelines. Most of its attention was focused on restoring essential services. Much less was paid to the critical areas of security, economic development, and Iraqi governance. There was also no detailed planning resolving what forces would be required to implement this strategy. When it was finally completed, General Abizaid's strategy was far more organized. His campaign plan was built around the 5 I's of internationalization, Iraqization, improvement of intelligence, infrastructure construction, and information and strategic communications. These were the 5 areas the general thought were vital to effectively winning Phase 4 of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Inherent in Abizaid's campaign plan was a reduction in the coalition footprint throughout 2004. As more and more Iraqi battalions became operational, the US presence in country would shrink to a position of strategic overwatch. Eventually, a force of 2 Army Brigade combat teams, a Special Forces detachment, and a moderate air and naval force would support the new Iraqi Army's 24 motorized infantry battalions and assume responsibility for Iraq's external and internal security. By the end of 2004, coalition force levels would, therefore, decrease from an October 2003 peak of 155,000 to just 30,000. Whilst General Abizaid and CENTCOM heavily emphasized the move to Iraqi security forces, General Sanchez and the rest of Combined Joint Task Force 7 was far more focused on hunting down former regime elements, especially CENTCOM's deck of cards targets. 5th Corps headquarters was also greatly hampered by its lack of staff, as most of its officers deployed on 90-day rotations and many had to fill the gaps in the CPA. This hindered General Sanchez from developing deeper and longer-term campaign plans and strategies, as often once those plans had finally been developed, events on the ground had overtaken them. In any case, he spent most of his time working with Ambassador Bremer, leaving operational control to his deputy, Major General Walter Wojciechowski, who did not hold superior rank to the various divisional COs under his command. This led to a lack of clear guidance from Core HQ, and each of the subordinate divisions spent the rest of 2003 essentially reacting to local events and not operating as part of a wider, integrated campaign. On July the 13th, CPA Regulation 6 recognized the 25-member Iraqi Governing Council. Originally intended to be a diverse group representing all of Iraq's ethno-religious factions, the council was, in fact, largely composed of expatriate elites who were immediately opposed to the local delegates. One of the most prominent Iraqi politicians who was not on the council was Muqtada al-Sadr. He was excluded due to the murder of Abdul Majid al-Kholi in April. This led the Sadrist movement as a whole to denounce the council as an illegitimate, foreign-imposed body. Additionally, as all former Ba'ath Party members were forbidden to participate in this political process, and essentially all prominent Sunnis were former members, the council's creation only further marginalized the Sunni Arabs. These concerns were reported to Bremer, but once again he pushed on with his own plans without gaining widespread approval. On September the 7th, he publicly revealed his plan for a transition to Iraqi sovereignty. Under Bremer's framework, the Iraqi Governing Council would write the new constitution, after which general elections would be held, the Coalition Provisional Authority would be dissolved and replaced by a normal diplomatic mission headed by the State Department. This announcement angered many Iraqis, including Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, one of the leading figures in the Shia world, who wanted an elected Iraqi government to write the constitution. It didn't take long for the Governing Council to make its mark. On September the 20th, it released a new de-Baathification policy, which imposed even greater restrictions than CPA Order 1. All Level 4 members were to be immediately fired, and any exceptions which had been implemented by Bremer were removed. Despite concerns about the wisdom of this policy, Bremer felt bound to follow the Council's wishes, and on November the 7th, transferred full authority for de-Baathification to it. The Council promptly set up a de-Baathification committee led by Ahmad Chalibi's nephew, Sam Chalibi, a resolute anti-Baathist. Ahmad and Sam Chalibi wasted no time in exerting their new power, firing 28,000 teachers and hundreds of civil servants for alleged Ba'ath Party ties in November alone. Chalibi even extorted former members for both financial and political gain. These actions only hardened the Sunni opposition at a time where the insurgency was starting to really gather momentum. But it wasn't just elites in Baghdad that were turning the Sunni population against the coalition and new Iraqi government. On September the 12th, a platoon of the 82nd Airborne Division was on patrol in Fallujah. As they moved through the city, they observed Iraqi police pursuing a BMW which had just conducted a drive-by shooting on the local police station. The police vehicle, realizing they had little hope of catching the attackers, turned around and headed back towards the station. As they did so, they drove towards the American patrol. Thinking the car was hostile, the paratroopers opened fire. In the ensuing firefight, 8 policemen and an attached Jordanian military officer were killed. During the chaotic incident, the local hospital was also damaged, and several other Jordanians were injured. This unfortunate event came precisely at the time local sheikhs were beginning to realize that the new Iraqi government was unlikely to work with them. Actions like this exemplify the challenges faced by coalition forces in Iraq, specifically the competing needs of winning hearts and minds and force protection, all whilst operating in a region and society they did not really understand. The never-ending challenge of distinguishing the enemy from the wider civilian populace in which they were embedded, combined with mounting casualties and insufficient resources, had the potential to drive low-level commanders to make emotional decisions, rather than the careful and precise operations necessary to operate safely whilst minimizing collateral damage and win the support of the Iraqi people. Unfortunately, episodes like this were far too common throughout the war, as scared junior officers operating in a foreign, confusing, and threatening battle space would often shoot first and ask questions later. The simple arithmetic was that every innocent Iraqi killed by the coalition only made the insurgency stronger. But in a theatre where any civilian car could be filled with armed insurgents, and every pile of trash on the side of the road could be an IED, hesitation could equal disaster, and local leaders were constantly juggling their men's safety with that of the Iraqi people around them. The one formation that quickly gained a reputation for heavy-handed tactics was the 4th Infantry Division. The Red Cross charged that the division was making aggressive neighbourhood sweeps without actionable intelligence and simply arresting military-aged males that seemed to put up resistance. Reportedly, a large number of these men simply joined the insurgency after being released. Many within the 4th Infantry considered these aggressive clearing tactics necessary. Their area of operations included Saddam's hometown, and thus resistance had been significant from their first deployment, and it only increased with time. Nonetheless, it appears as though the formation entered Iraq with a particularly aggressive mindset, treating its stabilization mission much as it would a conventional battle. Unlike other divisions, this area of operations lacked a major city, and instead contained dozens of small to medium-sized towns and countryside. Here, mortar attacks were extremely common, and the division relied upon counter-battery fire far more heavily than its counterparts. This heavy use of indirect fire was, in and of itself, more likely to generate collateral damage. Lieutenant Colonel Stephen D. Russell, a battalion commander deployed to Tikrit, concluded that the local populace detested the Americans and would only respond to displays of strength, an attitude which was common amongst the formation. Exactly how much of this was a self-fulfilling prophecy is hard to determine 2 decades later, but nonetheless, the 4th Infantry Division's approach to counterinsurgency throughout 2003 remains somewhat controversial. Despite the vast difference between the various divisions, most units soon realized that engagement with local sheiks and the quality of the interactions their soldiers had with average Iraqis could make or break stability in counterinsurgency operations. General Petraeus, the commander of the 101st Airborne, was one of the most innovative counterinsurgency proponents. He understood how critical the attitude of the local populace was to winning the larger campaign. In urban Nineveh, he heavily restricted the use of artillery and counter-battery fire for fear of inflicting collateral damage. He also abandoned cordon and sweep operations, where coalition infantry would isolate an area before detaining all military-aged males for questioning. Instead, he employed a cordon and knock tactic, where his troopers would simply walk up to the selected house, knock on the door, and politely request that the individual report to the unit for questioning. Another very successful innovation was the use of female soldiers to search women at checkpoints and in search operations. This protected the local men's wasta, an Iraqi conception of male status and influence. Offending the local men by having male soldiers physically search their wives and daughters was a significant cause of resentment. Both theatre and operational commanders were acutely aware of the danger of alienating the Iraqi people. Thus, General Sanchez did not initiate an operational level offensive throughout the autumn of 2003. The only core level action was Operation Chamberlain, which aimed to interdict insurgent lines of communication with Syria. On October 3, the 3rd Cavalry Regiment departed Fallujah to take up blocking positions along the Syrian border. Its orders were to prevent any military-aged male from crossing unless they were engaged in legitimate commerce. Generally speaking, Operation Chamberlain was a failure. Even if the major road crossings could be closed, the border was so long that there were just too many ways around the established crossings. The simple reality was the coalition lacked the strength to effectively close the border, and every time units surged from central Iraq in an attempt to do so, they weakened the coalition presence in more sensitive areas. In any case, by and large, the Iraqi insurgency did not require external financing or material support. Even without any access to Syria or Iran, there was so much unsecured munitions in Iraq that any militant group had easy access to all of the arms it needed from domestic sources. By mid-September, within the 4th Infantry sector, some 600,000 tons of ammunition had been identified, including 102 large ammunition caches and 3,000 other ammunition dumps requiring more than 10 tractor-trailers to move. By September, the 4th Infantry's engineers had used their entire supply of C4 simply disposing of Iraqi munitions. The story was the same across the country. There were so many unsecured artillery shells that IEDs simply became ubiquitous. Despite these counterinsurgency efforts at the division level and below, at Theatre Command the focus was still well and truly on the high-value targets listed on CENTCOM's deck of cards. Although this focus was probably a mistake, it did provide some notable successes. On August the 21st, a month after the killing of Uday and Qusay Hussein in Mosul, Special Forces operators captured Ali Hassan al-Majid just north of Baghdad. Chemical Ali was one of Saddam's most hated lieutenants, and his capture was hailed as a very significant success. A few weeks later, number 27 on the deck of cards list, former Minister of Defense General Sultan Hashim, surrendered to the 101st Airborne in Mosul. He had fled to his family's home after the regime's collapse, and members of his family convinced him to turn himself in. In response, the 101st offered him fair treatment. After his capture, the Iraqi Governing Council demanded that he be hanged, a request the coalition prevented. Despite these successes, Rumsfeld was growing impatient with the lack of progress. In early November, he wrote a scathing communique to both the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Abizaid, complaining bitterly about CENTCOM's failure to capture Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden quickly. On November 10, Abizaid wrote to the chairman, General Myers, "This really is an incredible sort of communication. Is this some sort of historical I told you so? Is this to cover impending bad news? It is professionally insulting. Can't quite fathom why Secretary Rumsfeld doesn't understand. We follow the Secretary's orders and guidance without complaint or question. We accord him great respect. A little bit of respect in return would do wonders for teamwork in this fight." Despite the political pressure to hunt down high-ranking targets, this top-down approach was counterproductive. It was a distraction from the real threat, the emerging nexus of interconnected terrorist and insurgent organizations across the Sunni triangle, and thus inhibited 5th Corps headquarters from really understanding the insurgency. The various divisional command groups, each of which faced its own local ethno-religious landscape, were also struggling to fully understand the enemy which they were now fighting on a daily basis. Each developed their own intelligence assessments which were, generally speaking, inaccurate and oversimplified. General Dempsey, the 1st Armoured Divisional CO, saw his enemy as 3 separate organisations: Fedayeen and other former regime paramilitary forces, organised crime, and Islamist groups. Deeming the jihadis to be the greatest threat, Dempsey focused his operations on Sunni Islamist extremists and their networks in and around Baghdad. In Anbar, the 82nd Airborne's commander, General Swanak, was primarily focused on the large contingent of foreign fighters and mujahideen, which had now entrenched themselves in Fallujah, Habbaniyah, and Al-Qaim. Swanak correctly identified some of the key local sheikhs but missed the wider involvement of local Sunni tribes and their support for the Islamists. The general complained that the people of Fallujah had a 16th century mindset, and that wider tribal allegiances were beginning to turn the people of Anbar against the 82nd Airborne. Similar conceptions were held by the 4th Infantry and 101st. Despite his humble beginnings and the fact that he was completely unknown before the war, by October, Zarqawi had risen to the top of everyone's target list. He was the first non-regime member to gain this level of attention. Although Coalition Command did not fully appreciate it at the time, between August and October, Anbar became the epicenter of the Sunni insurgency. Here, various jihadist and local insurgent groups fought to defeat the Iraqi police and gain full control of the strategically vital border area. Local police stations in Ramadi, Fallujah, and the border towns of Al-Qaim, Qusay and Ratba were persistently attacked by insurgents, inhibiting the ability of police to effectively patrol and thereby reducing their presence. The possession of these areas not only allowed for materiel and personnel to flow in from Syria, but the smuggling routes here were immensely profitable. A significant organised crime syndicate arose within the Sunni insurgency, and much of the illegal profits were used to fund their military operations. None of this was known to the coalition at the time. With the growing insurgent domination of Anbar, Zarqawi's organisation flourished. His spectacular terrorist attacks, which had achieved very substantial strategic success, had dramatically elevated his international status. Many members of Ansar al-Islam left their organisation and joined Zarqawi. His ranks were also swelled with local recruits, as many angry and disenfranchised Sunnis, some with extensive military experience, joined him. With the jihad now in full swing, international support also began to flow to Zarqawi. In November 2003, Al-Qaeda's leadership held a summit in the tribal areas of Pakistan. There, bin Laden decided to throw his financial weight behind Zarqawi. He announced that Al-Qaeda would provide $1.5 million per month to fund his operations. This communique was intercepted by US intelligence in early 2004. With the coalition now facing a full-blown insurgency, the short-sighted and optimistic force posture decisions which were made in the wake of the invasion were finally re-evaluated. It was clear from the beginning that the 5th Corps was not a large enough headquarters to manage the whole campaign. General Abizaid and General Sanchez requested that the 3rd Army headquarters, which was currently located in Kuwait, be reinstated as operational HQ. General McKinnon agreed to put this request to the Joint Chiefs later in the month. Additionally, the politically sensitive subject of aggregate troop strength was also raised. This was a taboo topic for Rumsfeld, who had invested significant personal capital in portraying Iraq as a quick and easy war. Despite the sensitivity of the topic, both Abizaid and Sanchez requested additional forces to meet the growing list of demands required of the coalition. Both Rumsfeld and Army Forces Command were reluctant, the latter of which was attempting to conduct a significant force modernization program, which required units to return to the United States for extended periods. Despite the situation on the ground and CENTCOM's request for more forces, Rumsfeld directed that the force in Iraq be cut from its current strength of 125,000 to 100,000 by March 2004. The number of Allied troops in the theatre would also be reduced from 35,000 to less than 25,000. These poor decisions by the Secretary of Defense had the unintended consequence of massively increasing the number of civilian contractors that were employed in Iraq. Individual divisions relied on contractors to provide many critical tasks, such as running various military systems, work on reconstruction, and provide logistical services. These services were absolutely necessary, given the small military footprint, but with the massive influx of contractors, effective oversight became more and more difficult. Many of these civilian contractors were inefficient, if not corrupt, wasting money and prioritizing the wrong projects. After Zarqawi single-handedly ended much of the coalition's international support, reducing the UN's footprint dramatically and displaying the dangerous security situation to NGOs, CENTCOM turned to another of General Abizaid's 5 Is, Iraqization. A core component of this strategy was the development of the new Iraqi security services, which Abizaid hoped would act as a buffer between the coalition and the Iraqi people. The original plan envisaged that, by the end of 2004, coalition forces would be aided by a regular Iraqi army composed of 3 motorized infantry divisions, 40,000 Iraqi Civil Defense Corps troops, which are akin to the National Guard or Army Reserve, 45,000 provincial and national police, 50,000 Facilities Protection Service members, and 7,000 border guards. As ambitious as that plan was, by December 2003, it was decided to increase the total strength of the new security forces to 200,000. However, the coalition was completely under-resourced for this colossal challenge. Training, equipping, and deploying 200,000 troops in a 12-month period was difficult enough, but the radical de-Baathification policy had effectively removed a large element of the available pool of recruits, including those with military experience. Finally, the coalition simply lacked the available trainers, and the promised contractors never arrived. Despite the focus placed upon the Iraqi army, it was the national police that were perhaps the most critical arm of the new security forces. These were the units that were actually on the ground across the Sunni triangle. However, and despite its critical importance, it was this service that was perhaps in the worst shape. The Iraqi police had already suffered from very severe corruption and malformed training practices. Hiring was highly nepotistic, and its ranks were filled with thousands of ghost police, members who were on the payroll but did not show up for work. In September 2003, Combined Joint Task Force 7 reported that more than 60,000 of the planned Iraqi police force of 77,000 were working, but only around 30,000 of those were actually policing. And even that figure was misleading. Despite showing up for work, many Iraqi police of this period were poorly trained and motivated. During a Thanksgiving visit to Iraq, Abizaid spoke with a battalion executive officer whose experiences echoed his own concerns. The Iraqi police are broken to an almost indescribable degree. For the first few weeks of joint patrols, we literally had to chase them down in the streets to get them to walk with us. I had to coerce an Iraqi police to get him to complete a foot patrol with me. The situation is slowly improving, but the police still have no radios, limited uniforms, not enough weapons, and no windows or doors in any of their police stations. We still have a long way to go before they're ready to be partners in keeping the peace. Over and above the police, the development of the Iraqi security forces as a whole lacked consistency in terms of composition, resources, and organization. One of the core problems in developing these forces was the manner in which Ambassador Bremer treated the whole endeavour. As this was under the CPA's authority, General Sanchez was essentially forbidden from overseeing the mission. However, much of the training of these forces, especially the civil defense forces, fell to the divisions under his command. In a now very familiar story, the coalition effort devolved to the divisions, and thus lacked operational coherence. Unlike the new Iraqi army, which took recruits from all over the country, for the other security forces, each of the divisions tended to recruit local tribal groups and militias, as this was often the easiest means of staffing these formations. However, The unintentional consequence of this was that these local forces would often only protect parochial local interests, inhibiting the ability of the force as a whole to operate nationally. These shortcomings would be revealed to all during the crisis of 2004. Despite the lack of tactical and operational coherence across the theatre, again an outcome of the weakness of 5th Corps headquarters, and the lack of a clear and modern counterinsurgency doctrine to guide them, each of the divisions continued to adapt to their own local circumstances. In Baghdad, General Dempsey had 30,000 troops under his command, with which he had to secure a city of 5.6 million people. It eventually became clear that he simply lacked the resources to man traffic control points and outposts throughout the city, so Dempsey switched to an offensive posture. The 1st Armoured routinely executed raids on suspected insurgent locations and began monitoring the city's mosques for signs of unrest. Far out in the western desert, on the Syrian border, the 3rd Armoured Cavalry Regiment began to experiment with new techniques for interdicting the flow of foreign fighters. Instead of trying to seal the border, the cavalrymen executed nighttime search and destroy operations. After securing a portion of a border town or area of interest, blocking all entry and exit points, the regiment would then do a thorough search. Any intelligence generated by the operation would serve as the foundation for the next night's offensive. By this means, the 3rd Armoured Cavalry was able to unearth several insurgent networks. These were tactics that would eventually be employed by the 82nd Airborne throughout Anbar. All of the divisions began to incorporate exogenous units into their areas of operations, including civil affairs groups from the CPA and Joint Special Forces task forces. As almost all of the divisions were short of personnel, maneuver elements were routinely deployed on reconstruction projects, and artillerymen as infantry. Military police, intelligence, and other division support units were routinely dispersed across the maneuver brigades, a practice which eventually became widespread. None of this had been envisaged prior to deployment. The highly complex battle space forced US divisions to simultaneously conduct combat and stability operations, requiring them to adapt their targeting processes to generate both lethal and non-lethal effects. This was a very challenging endeavour. For example, an infantry company may have to disperse a crowd and engage a group of armed insurgents during the same patrol, requiring the employment of very different weapons. By the end of the 4th Infantry's deployment, the division had adopted a model first developed by General Petraeus' 101st Airborne, which was a blend of operations that was 10% offensively focused and 90% reconstruction. With the widespread employment of aggressive cordon and sweep operations across the Sunni Triangle and the ever-growing insurgency, coalition forces were soon being faced with a growing detainee problem. Not only were the numbers of prisoners steadily increasing, but the coalition lacked a reliable method of identifying prisoners or tracking them once they were in custody. Inevitably, many young men who had not been part of the insurgency ended up in the coalition's custody, and often influential Iraqis complained that knowing where individuals were within the system was difficult. This generated even more resentment amongst the Iraqi populace. After the collapse of the regime, most of the available prisons had been looted, and the under-resourced coalition lacked both the personnel and the facilities to house the thousands of prisoners they were now taking. The obvious option was to reopen the Abu Ghraib prison in the outskirts of Baghdad, but both Bremer and Sanchez were reluctant to do so. For many Iraqis, Abu Ghraib was a symbol of the horrors of life under Saddam. Many had endured systematic torture there, after which some had been summarily executed. Several mass graves were found in its immediate vicinity. Thus, considering the Sunni insurgency was now well and truly underway, the optics of US military personnel detaining thousands of Iraqis in Saddam's worst prison were hardly ideal. Nevertheless, it was the only large-scale facility that had not been extensively damaged during the invasion, and thus could be brought online quickly. Sanchez deployed the 800th Military Police Brigade to Abu Ghraib, a reserve unit commanded by Brigadier General Janis Karpinski. The brigade was ordered to man the facility and run the prison. Interrogations of prisoners were left to Colonel Thomas Pappas and his 205th Military Intelligence Brigade. However, both brigades lacked personnel who had actually been trained in these roles. Military police were not, after all, corrections officers, and the Military Intelligence Brigade had to continue to provide intelligence to theatre headquarters whilst manning the facility. Despite these shortcomings, with so many prisoners, Abu Ghraib was operating at full capacity within weeks. In August, General Sanchez decided to visit the facility to try and gain a better understanding of the insurgency himself. He was shocked by what he saw. Located just to the southeast of Fallujah, Abu Ghraib was right in the middle of a hotbed of insurgent activity. it was receiving daily mortar attacks. This was clearly having a very negative impact on the young reservists who were manning the facility. With military discipline starting to erode, it was clear to Sanchez that Brigadier Kaprinsky was not up to the task. With no immediate replacement, he placed Colonel Pappas in charge, but this did little to aid the often poor condition of the detainees. There were 7,000 prisoners held within its walls, a population that was guarded by just 92 military police. This severely undermanned force had stopped vetting detainees and therefore separating high-value prisoners from the rank and file, which significantly hampered intelligence gathering operations. With so few available resources, the coalition was forced to rely on military contractors to fill the shortfall. However, these individuals often lacked training in interrogation techniques, policy, and doctrine, an oversight which would have very serious consequences. Another complication was the unclear legal status of these prisoners. It was not immediately clear whether they were enemy prisoners of war, which were then provided protection under the Third Geneva Convention, civilian detainees, who were protected by the Fourth Geneva Convention, or unlawful enemy combatants, which the Bush administration had determined were not entitled to any protection under the Geneva Conventions. Ultimately, it was decided that most met the definition of civilian detainees, although some were unlawful enemy combatants. This legal confusion was fertile ground for misconduct and abuse. At the beginning of the global war on terror, President Bush had approved the use of enhanced interrogation techniques on those legally judged to be unlawful enemy combatants. These techniques, which were not listed in the Army's Field Manual 3452, most famously included the application of waterboarding or simulated drowning, but others included being placed in very confined spaces, such as a box for long periods, or long-term sleep deprivation. None of these methods of interrogation, which arguably meet the definition of torture, were approved by the Geneva Convention. In a 2002 incident which occurred at an American base in Bagram, Afghanistan, 2 prisoners died whilst being subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques. Elements of the 519th Military Intelligence Battalion, which had just come from Afghanistan, instituted these same interrogation practices at the Abu Ghraib prison. Over and above its questionable moral, ethical, and legal status, this change in policy also led to significant confusion regarding what did and did not constitute acceptable treatment of prisoners, especially those meeting the legal definition of civilian detainees. After inspecting the facility, Major General Ryder reported to Sanchez that the combination of a lack of training, resources, and oversight at the prison made the potential for human rights abuses significant. Between October 25 and November 6, severe mistreatment of prisoners occurred at Abu Ghraib. That week, an Army Reserve unit arrived from Maryland, the 372nd Military Police Company. They were ordered to guard the Tier 1 section, which housed the most dangerous prisoners. The unit had received minimal mission-specific training prior to deployment, and supervision and oversight at the prison was poor. During that week, the reservists began mistreating prisoners. On October the 25th, a group of MPs dragged a naked prisoner around the cell block with a leash around his neck. They took photos with him posing with a female trooper, Private First Class Lindy England. This would be a demeaning moment for anyone, but in Iraqi culture, which has very well-defined gender roles and a strong cultural conception of masculinity, this was particularly traumatic and offensive behaviour. Other prisoners were forced to make human pyramids, systematically beaten, and even raped. Pictures of this activity later surfaced, causing a worldwide uproar. But far worse conduct was later revealed. On November the 3rd, a prisoner arrived who was believed to be involved in the killing of 5 Americans. He was forced to stand in stress positions for hours, beaten, and threatened with electrocution. 2 days later, on November the 5th, another prisoner died whilst being interrogated by civilian contractors. An autopsy revealed his death was caused by a severe blow to the head and was ruled a homicide. Although US command took several months to become aware of this behaviour, and despite the fact that it was the result of a small element of all coalition forces, the abuses of Abu Ghraib would not only harden Iraqi opposition, but morally frame the war for many across the international community. Despite the emerging Iraqi insurgency, coalition forces continued to press forward with the planned drawdown of the force throughout early 2004. Notwithstanding the growing intensity of hostile activity, thus far in the campaign, the insurgency as a whole lacked any coherence or overarching strategy. Unlike South Vietnam, where the United States faced a single enemy, the Sunni insurgency was a hodgepodge of numerous different groups, each of which had its own command structure, unique objectives, and tactics. Some acted as a classic guerrilla force, engaging coalition units with ambushes and more or less conventional firefights, whilst others relied primarily on IEDs and suicide bombers. Although this heterogeneity meant the insurgency struggled to achieve more strategic objectives, it also made it more difficult to successfully disrupt, as an effective counterinsurgency operation targeting one group or cell did nothing to impede the others. But in the end of 2003, this feature of the wider Sunni insurgency began to evolve. Realizing that the lack of coordination between the numerous Sunni resistance and jihadist organizations was leading to a missed strategic opportunity, in early October, at least 3 major Sunni resistance groups decided to initiate a major, coordinated offensive against the coalition and the embryonic Iraqi security forces. This offensive was to be executed during the holy month of Ramadan, which, in 2003, began on October the 26th. Jaish Muhammad, or the Army of Muhammad, had grown significantly over the past months, primarily by absorbing former members of the Fedayeen Saddam. It had also established a significant relationship with the National Islamic Resistance Front, which was commanded by a former Iraqi colonel and Saddam's half-brother, Sabawai Ibrahim al-Tikriti, the latter of which was based in Syria. Tikriti had made a deal with the Syrians which allowed the organisation to use Syrian territory as a base of operations and to purchase supplies and materiel at discounted prices. Jaish Muhammad was able to leverage Tikriti's Syrian support network to amass supplies for the coming Ramadan offensive. Alongside Jaish Muhammad and the National Islamic Resistance, an offshoot of Ansar al-Islam, Ansar al-Sunnah, also prepared to initiate a significant surge in operational tempo during Ramadan. The offensive began on October the 26th. During this time, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Paul Wolfowitz, happened to be visiting Iraq. After spending time meeting local commanders in Tikrit, Wolfowitz had returned to the Rashid Hotel in Baghdad. As he was staying in the hotel, it was struck by rocket artillery fire. Although Wolfowitz was not injured, this attack killed a US Army colonel and wounded 16 others. That day, a gunman assassinated the deputy mayor of Baghdad, and at Abu Ghraib, a soldier was killed by a mortar attack. The next morning, a suicide bomber detonated a truck bomb in front of the Red Crescent's headquarters in Baghdad, another example of the direct targeting of NGOs by the insurgency. That attack killed 12 civilians. Over the next 45 minutes, a coordinated suicide bombing operation was executed across Baghdad, in which 5 Iraqi police stations were attacked with vehicle-borne IEDs. The resulting explosions killed 1 American soldier, 26 Iraqi civilians, and 8 police officers. A 6th attack was successfully thwarted when police apprehended a Sudanese national driving another truck bomb. Throughout the 26th and 27th of October, combat raged across Baghdad and the Sunni Triangle. In numerous minor actions, including ambushes, mortar and IED attacks, the coalition and Iraqi security forces suffered 47 killed and 224 wounded. Throughout the rest of Ramadan, attacks on coalition forces, NGOs, and the Iraqi security services continued to rise, before eventually peaking at 45 per day. The Ramadan offensive also saw the introduction of new insurgent tactics. Even with the employment of IEDs, when they moved in heavily armoured and protected convoys, coalition forces were relatively well protected, and engaging dismounted infantry directly exposed insurgent forces to the very significant firepower possessed by coalition formations. However, coalition personnel were especially vulnerable in aircraft. Unlike infantry fighting vehicles or even Humvees, if a helicopter was damaged, this often caused a crash that inflicted heavy casualties. Thus, across the Ramadan offensive, militant groups began to far more deliberately target coalition aircraft, especially as they were operating at low altitude. On October the 26th, a Black Hawk was shot down by an RPG in Tikrit, luckily only leading to 5 minor casualties. A much more significant incident occurred on November the 2nd. As it was departing a forward operating base west of Baghdad, Albu Issa tribesmen shot down a CH-47 Chinook, killing 16 soldiers in the process. This one attack made November the 2nd the deadliest day of the war for American forces since March the 23rd, the worst day of the invasion. A few days later, another Black Hawk was brought down over Tikrit, killing another 6 US servicemen. During the same period, intense enemy fire caused 2 Black Hawks to collide over Mosul, killing another 17 soldiers, and bringing the total American dead over a 14-day period to 60. The losses due to aircraft incidents alone represented a significant increase in casualties being sustained by the US military. During the Ramadan offensive, Zarqawi continued attacking strategic targets. As he had since beginning active operations in Iraq, Zarqawi aimed to pressurize areas of strategic vulnerability, as opposed to simply trying to inflict casualties on the Americans. After successfully deterring the United Nations from deploying more resources into Iraq, he shifted his focus to more vulnerable coalition partners. On November the 12th, a suicide bomber detonated a vehicle-borne IED just outside of the Italian military's headquarters in Nasiriyah. This attack killed 19 Italian soldiers and 8 Iraqis, making it the bloodiest day in Italy's military history since World War II. During the rest of the month, insurgents killed 2 Japanese diplomats, 2 Korean contractors, and 1 Colombian. But it wasn't just Zarqawi's organization that was targeting the coalition's international partners. On November the 29th, Ansar al-Islam caught a group of Spanish intelligence agents in an ambush, killing 7. In all, these attacks brought the total number of coalition casualties to nearly 1,000, 126 killed in action, and over 750 wounded. Thus, the losses in the Ramadan offensive alone surpassed the total sustained throughout both the invasion and the occupation to October the 26th. It was by far the deadliest month experienced thus far by the coalition. Over and above these very significant coalition casualties, the Ramadan offensive heavily targeted the Iraqi state. During the month, over 1,000 insurgent attacks were directed at Iraqi infrastructure, Iraqi security forces, or Iraqis believed to be supporting the coalition. Throughout this period, attacks on Iraqis doubled, with 74 recorded attacks on Iraqi civilians and 84 directed at Iraqi security services. The offensive culminated in one final battle. On November the 30th, 2 convoys of the 4th Infantry Division were driving through downtown Samarra, delivering new Iraqi currency to 7 local banks. As the convoy moved through the city, they were ambushed by hundreds of insurgents. Attacking in company strength and dressed in the uniform of the Fedayeen Saddam, the insurgents hit the convoy with several well-executed ambushes, employing crew-served weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The convoy was heavily defended, however. Despite the ferocity of the ambush, the troopers of the 4th Infantry Division inflicted heavy casualties. In the wake of the battle, the streets of Samarra were filled with dead and dying Fedayeen, with over 50 confirmed enemy killed in action. Although the Ramadan offensive did not, in and of itself, represent a serious strategic defeat for the coalition, it clearly showed how capable, coordinated, and resourced the Sunni insurgency was becoming, and how much of a fight lay before the coalition. This was far, far more than the dead enders Rumsfeld had predicted would be easily defeated, but rather a collection of actors that were becoming a formidable military force. Nevertheless, the Ramadan offensive did have a significant strategic impact, especially in Washington. In response to widespread fears that the escalating violence in Iraq was leading the United States into a quagmire, on November the 15th, the Bush administration announced that it was accelerating the transition to Iraqi control. The new timeline called for the selection of a transitional assembly that would elect a provisional government in June 2004, just 7 months instead of the originally planned 2 to 3 years. At this time, Iraq would be granted sovereignty and the CPA would be dissolved, and it was hoped that the quick transition to Iraqi control would project an air of success and therefore reduce popular support for the insurgency. These would prove to be false hopes indeed. The Ramadan offensive also had a significant impact on American allies. The loss of life placed significant pressure on Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi to withdraw from Iraq, and a similar popular sentiment soon began to emerge in Britain. For Washington, keeping the coalition of the willing intact in the midst of a full-blown insurgency was becoming an increasingly difficult proposition. In the build-up to the Ramadan offensive, coalition operational leadership at 5th Corps headquarters had been consumed with the seemingly disjointed attacks across the country, the problems with detentions and planning for the coming troop withdrawal, and the significant preparations for the insurgent offensive had simply been missed. Nonetheless, it didn't take the coalition long to react. Midway through the offensive, coalition divisions began launching a significant counterattack. By November the 12th, the 1st Armoured Division launched a series of operations designed to disrupt enemy operations around Baghdad. These included the heavy application of counter-battery fire directed at enemy mortar positions and the establishment of numerous military checkpoints throughout the city. To counter the increased IED threat, coalition troops were ordered to engage anyone seen digging along the sides of the road at night. On the 10th of December, after insurgents attacked a group of Spanish troops moving between Baghdad and Anbar, the 82nd Airborne initiated a coordinated offensive, raiding 18 locations. Further west, a week later, the 3rd Armoured Cavalry Regiment attacked a training camp near Rawa, capturing 11 high-value targets and a large stockpile of electronics and weapons. In the northern sector, the 101st were no less active. On December the 10th, the division executed simultaneous raids on no fewer than 34 targets in Mosul, leading to the capture of 54 suspected insurgents and a former Fedayeen general. Unsurprisingly, the response of the 4th Infantry Division was far more aggressive. It immediately went on the offensive, scouring Tikrit, Bakuba, Kirkuk, and Balad for enemy operatives, netting some 600 suspected insurgents in the process. Although all of the divisions believed they had very successfully interdicted local insurgent networks, the only way they could measure their success was by the number of insurgents removed from the battle space and the material that went with them. But without a clear picture of the enemy they were actually facing, coalition leadership had no real way of knowing if these efforts were actually making a significant difference. It was in their response to the Ramadan offensive that coalition command demonstrated just how little they understood the enemy that had now taken the field against them. On October the 28th, 2 days into the offensive, Abizaid briefed the Joint Chiefs that he believed the insurgency consisted of approximately 4,000 former regime loyalists, 2,000 members of Ansar al-Islam, and an unknown number of foreign fighters, although he judged the number of jihadis cited elsewhere to have been an overestimation. This grossly understated the scale of the insurgency. For example, there were over 10,000 suspected insurgents sitting in Abu Ghraib, all of which were captured prior to Ramadan. Colonel Derek Harvey, the leader of the Red Cell intelligence team at theatre headquarters, believed Abizaid was massively understating the problem. He assessed that the insurgency's networks were larger and more complex than previously appreciated. In a report titled Sunni Arab Resistance, Politics of the Gun, Harvey detailed how Iraq's highly militarized society, paramilitary organizations, and intelligence services established under Saddam's regime had provided the foundation for a well-trained and organized insurgency. After the fall of the regime, an estimated 65,000 to 95,000 Special Republican Guard officers, intelligence officers, Fedayeen Saddam forces, and Baath Party militias had faded into the population in and around Baghdad. Added to this 100,000-strong Baathist insurgency was the metastasis of Islamist militant and global jihadist organizations. It soon became clear that the coalition was also severely underreporting the number of attacks. For example, most units were only reporting IED incidents if they inflicted any casualties or damaged a vehicle. But, at that point in the war, over half of all IED attacks were unsuccessful. Additionally, engagements that involved the Iraqis were not being reported either. Once these mistakes were rectified in early 2004, Iraq started to look like a much more violent place. The Ramadan offensive also underscored just how much of a threat the improvised explosive device was becoming. Although the IED had always been the insurgents' weapon of choice, the effectiveness of IED attacks skyrocketed during the offensive. In the month of June, the total number of effective IED attacks, incidents which inflicted damage or casualties, was 8. During the Ramadan offensive, the coalition suffered 95. Average soldiers were keenly aware of the threat these weapons posed, and just how unprotected they were in soft-skinned vehicles. Many began to add improvised or hillbilly armour to their Humvees, in the form of jury-rigged steel plates and even wood. By November, Humvee armour kits were pouring into the theatre, and self-protection jammers, which prevented radio detonation, were also starting to be fielded. Abizaid was very concerned by the proliferation and effectiveness of IEDs, and thus asked Rumsfeld and General Myers for a Manhattan Project-like effort to counter this threat. In response, an IED task force was created under Brigadier General Joseph Votel that would eventually grow into the Joint IED Defeat Organization, but its progress was slow. More immediate gains were made by the merger of local efforts. In Baghdad, US Special Forces had learned that numerous coalition units were working on their own counter-IED measures and tactics. They succeeded in merging American, British, and Australian explosive ordnance specialists into one joint task force. Called the Combined Explosives Exploitation Cell, or SEXI for short, this unit, which was given the nickname the CSI of the counter-IED fight, scoured blast sites for fingerprints and other forensic evidence. Eventually, they were able to identify specific bomb makers. Evidence gathered by SEXI led to the capture of the cell responsible for the rocket attack on Wolfowitz's hotel. By December, the task force had produced IED smart cards, which included diagrams and pictures of common IEDs and the most effective way to disarm or defeat them. Over the past 6 months, the attention of Combined Joint Task Force 7 had been largely focused on the capture of former regime leadership, targets immortalised by CENTCOM's infamous deck of cards. Indeed, the fixation on Baathist leadership had allowed much of the Sunni insurgency to go unnoticed. However, the theatre-wide manhunt was beginning to bear fruit. In early December, Izzat Ibrahim al-Duri's private secretary had been captured in the town of Hawija. Although al-Duri himself had not been located, coalition forces now believed they were closing in on Saddam's inner circle, and potentially the man himself. Coalition leadership hoped that the capture of Saddam Hussein would prove to be a real strategic turning point, robbing the insurgency of much of its momentum. Throughout the summer and autumn of 2003, the soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division had forged an increasingly close working relationship with the numerous special forces operating in northern Iraq. Rumours of Saddam's presence flooded into division headquarters, so much so that they were dubbed Elvis sightings by the men. However, both Special Operations and 4th Infantry Division's leadership concluded that Saddam was hiding somewhere in Saladin province. After months of trying to track down other regime members with the hope that this would lead them to Saddam, including no fewer than 600 Special Forces raids and 300 interrogations, intelligence collection activities which seemed to lead nowhere, 4th Division Intelligence and their Special Forces partners realised that they were trying to follow the wrong network. Rather than unearthing other Baathist leaders, the key to finding Saddam was detecting the unofficial security apparatus protecting him. This network consisted of less prominent figures who had close tribal or familial ties to Saddam. This proved to be the key insight. After building a clear picture of Saddam's wider family and clan, and directing significant surveillance on this wider informal network, including interrogations of 40 family members, Special Forces operators captured Brigadier General Daham Mahmedi, who was in direct contact with Saddam via courier. Mahmedi directed interrogators to question Mohammed al-Muslit, a bodyguard and relative of Saddam. He was, in fact, already in custody, but had been concealing his identity. Al-Muslit held the keys to the castle. Based on intelligence generated from his interrogation, Coalition Special Forces identified 2 farms on the eastern bank of the Tigris as possible target locations. The farm compound at Ad-Dor was an excellent location. Its surrounding area was heavily vegetated, providing concealment and numerous avenues of escape. In fact, this location was the riverside orchard where Saddam famously had swum the Tigris to escape capture after his failed attempt to assassinate Iraqi leader Abdul Karim Qasem in 1959. Thus, it was not only well known to him, but it was a place of psychological comfort. The very real possibility that Saddam might escape again meant any raid on the compound had to be perfectly executed. Saddam's personal security team was thought to number between 20 and 30, all of whom would be heavily armed. Thus, the prospect of a very serious firefight made taking the dictator alive a far greater challenge. The operation to capture Saddam was planned by Colonel James Hickey, the 1st Brigade CO, and Special Forces operators from Task Force 121, which was a unit composed of elements from all over Special Operations Command, Delta Force, the 75th Ranger Regiment, SEAL Team 6, and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, amongst others. Its rather dramatic, and somewhat ironic, code name was Operation Red Dawn. If anything, Red Dawn was over-engineered from the outset. It involved a force of 2 infantry battalions from the 4th Infantry Division's 1st Brigade Combat Team, the 299th Engineer Battalion, an aviation detachment, an artillery battalion, cavalry forces, and then 2 special operation teams from Task Force 121. The plan involved the infantry battalions forming an outer cordon on both sides of the Tigris. These forces would be provided with significant indirect fire support in the form of artillery and Apache attack helos. Then, the cavalry forces would establish an inner cordon around the 2 target locations, codenamed Wolverine 1 and 2. Delta Force's C Squadron, supported by ISA operators and an armoured cavalry detachment, would then assault the 2 targets by armoured vehicle. Perhaps the commitment of the better part of a brigade combat team was excessive, but clearly US Command had no wish to repeat the failure of Tora Bora, the one time during the invasion of Afghanistan US Special Forces came within reach of Osama bin Laden. Operation Red Dawn began just after dusk on December 13, 2003. After the manoeuvre elements established the outer cordon, the 2 Special Forces teams assaulted the farmhouses. Delta Force rolled in hard and fast, and by 7:50 p.m, Colonel Hickley received confirmation that Wolverine 1 was clear. As C Squadron moved through the second farmhouse, they made contact with a small number of hostiles, presumably Saddam's personal security team. These men fled north, hoping to lure the Americans away from the small farmhouse where Saddam had been staying. Delta Force quickly cleared the compound. There they found a pair of AKMs and $750,000 in cash, but no Saddam Hussein. It was clear that they had found a safe house which was being used by someone significant, but the initial search did not reveal anything more. With her location secure, Muhammad al-Muslit was brought to the compound, and with his aid, a more thorough search led the men to a small piece of styrofoam that appeared to be a piece of rubbish. According to the Iraqi-American translator who was present at the raid, Samir, Muslit led them to a pile of rubbish, and when Samir demanded to know where the entrance was, he simply replied, "You're standing on it." After digging through the dirt and leaves, one of the operators found what turned out to be a hatch. He fired a few rounds into the piece of styrofoam, and in reply a voice cried out in Arabic. The men peeled away the hatch to reveal a small tunnel. Inside the spider hole they found an angry-looking, unkempt man with a long beard who, according to Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Russell, one of the battalion commanders who was present at the raid, looked remarkably similar to John Brown of Civil War days. Samir later remembered that once they had opened the styrofoam hatch and peered inside, he could only see part of what looked to be a man. Demanding to see the man's hands, Samir jumped into the small hole and grabbed the suspect. After dragging him out into the open and seeing his face, he was sure it was Saddam. The all-powerful dictator was clearly in bad shape. He smelled terrible and had the appearance of a homeless man. Samir demanded to know who he was. "Saddam," he replied. "Saddam who?" barked Samir. "Hussein," the man answered meekly. Samir was a member of Iraq's oppressed Shia majority. He had fled Iraq in the wake of the Intifada and became a US citizen. In that moment, years of pent-up hatred exploded. As the Delta Force men watched, Samir proceeded to beat Saddam, punching him in the mouth and calling him a rat. Wanting a memento of the moment, he threw one of the operators a camera, who then captured one of the most iconic images of the Iraq War. Samir pinning the almighty Saddam Hussein on the ground, blood visible in his mouth. When an American officer asked who he was, Saddam replied, "I am Saddam Hussein, the duly elected president of Iraq. I am willing to negotiate." For the coalition, the capture of Saddam represented a real moment of jubilation. On December the 14th, Ambassador Bremer opened a press briefing by exclaiming, "Ladies and gentlemen, we got him." The widespread feeling of euphoria, one which was shared by the coalition generals and the president, was fortified by a notable drop-off in insurgent activity, especially across the north. In fact, in the weeks following Saddam's capture, the Upper Tigris Valley region saw the first real period of peace since the invasion began. This success was followed by a number of offensives in the Baghdad region that resulted in a notably meek insurgent response. These signs led Sanchez to the optimistic conclusion that with Saddam's fall, the figurehead behind which the Baathist insurgency was orbiting had fallen, and with it the uniting purpose driving the numerous former regime elements and insurgent groups. This evaluation was, however, based upon a foundational misunderstanding of what the Sunni insurgency fundamentally was. It was never just a Baathist attempt to reinstall Saddam. In fact, by the end of 2003, the Sunni insurgency as a whole had mutated into something altogether more virulent. The fusion of Baathist authoritarianism, Salafi jihadism, and the Iraqi Sunni tribal culture of entitlement and grievance combined to form a malignant military and geopolitical force that would not only transcend the fall of Saddam, it would persist until 2017. Evidence of these alliances of convenience between foreign jihadis and regime remnants that General Abizaid had feared arose within days. In fact, Saddam's capture could not have been more irrelevant to Zarqawi, his ranks now swelling with former Baathists. His campaign of terror continued unabated. On December the 27th, Zarqawi executed another coordinated set of mass casualty attacks. This time, his target was the Shia holy city of Karbala. In a very sophisticated operation, Zarqawi employed a combination of suicide bombers using vehicle-borne IEDs, mortar bombardment and ambushes to inflict very significant casualties. That day, insurgents struck 2 coalition military bases located at the university, the local police station and the mayor's office. The attacks left 13 dead, 6 of whom were coalition soldiers from the Bulgarian and Thai militaries, and more than 170 wounded. Amongst that number was 37 coalition personnel, including 5 Americans. Alarmed at both the scale of the violence and the effectiveness of Zarqawi's tactics, General Dempsey ordered additional fortifications to be erected throughout the capital. but just a few hours later, another car bomb obliterated the Nabil restaurant in downtown Baghdad, a popular spot frequented by Westerners and wealthy Iraqis. 8 people died there, and dozens more were injured. Although that particular attack was the worst, it was but one of many such explosions that rocked Iraq that day. Despite the optimistic tone of coalition leadership, many on the ground feared that the capture of Saddam was not a positive watershed, but rather that the worst was yet to come. Combat operations during the conventional stage of Operation Iraqi Freedom between March and April 2003 resulted in 172 coalition killed in action and almost 600 wounded. Nearly 5,000 Iraqis lost their lives as a result of those combat operations. In the 8 months that passed between the time President Bush gave his infamous Mission Accomplished speech on May the 1st and the end of the year, the coalition sustained casualties of 408 killed and 2,000 wounded. Over the same 8-month period, more than 10,000 insurgents were captured and over 600 killed. Those casualty numbers, combined with the challenges and complexity of stabilization missions, demonstrate that it was Phase 4, not Phase 3, that was the decisive phase of military operations in the Iraq War. Notwithstanding this probably foreseeable reality, the planning time, resources, and even personnel allocated for Phase 3 far exceeded those for Phase 4. In many ways, it was this abject neglect of Operation Iraqi Freedom's Phase 4 where the original sin of the Iraq War rests, a failure born out of both the American military's institutional aversion to stabilization missions and the misguided political beliefs which permeated the neoconservative elements of the Bush administration. A consequence of this neglect was the utterly inadequate capabilities and organizational structures put in place immediately after the invasion. The Coalition Provisional Authority and Combined Joint Task Force 7 were utterly inadequate replacements for the Iraqi state as a whole, an apparatus which was abruptly torn to pieces by the rash and ill-considered CPA Orders 1 and 2. As de-Baathification and the disbanding of the Iraqi security services brought about the utter collapse of the Iraqi state in the summer of 2003, the resulting void in state power and governance was filled by Sunni resistance organizations, Islamic terrorists, Shia militias, the Iranian regime and Kurdish factions, all of which were vying for power, influence and autonomy in a stateless Iraq. A set of circumstances that, in the words of the US official history, ceded the initiative from the coalition military forces to Iraq's various insurgent groups for years to come. At the end of 2003, the US military found itself embroiled in a long-term invasion of Iraq, a campaign it had simply not expected to wage. This lack of foresight and planning can be attributed to a number of factors. When President Bush ordered the US military to begin planning for an invasion of Iraq in November 2001, CENTCOM was surprised by both the ambitious nature of the campaign and its timing. Pressured by both the scope of the challenge and the ongoing war in Afghanistan, the campaign plan that CENTCOM produced relied heavily on the late Cold War doctrinal concepts with which the wider American military was most comfortable. Late Cold War American doctrine had shaped its military into an organization that was an exceptional exponent of maneuver warfare principles. Engaging a peer or near peer in a large-scale maneuver battle at the lower operational level of warfare is exactly what the American military was good at. In fact, it may have been better at that kind of warfare than any other military in history. Unsurprisingly, when Franks and the staff at CENTCOM produced a campaign plan for the invasion of Iraq, the maneuver phase was exquisitely planned and would be expertly executed. But these same general officers who had risen to prominence during the 1980s were also shaped by the cultural scars of the Vietnam War. For the US military of the late Cold War, counterinsurgency and stabilization was a mission set that only produced painful memories, which the institution as a whole had very much tried to move beyond. There was also an implicit assumption that the Vietnam experience had taught Washington a painful lesson, and as political leadership would never get the nation bogged down in that kind of nightmare again, focusing on counterinsurgency was a waste of time. Thus, throughout the 1980s and 1990s, doctrinal development focused squarely on the Soviet-style conventional enemy, and not unearthing the insurgent. Therefore, when President Bush set the United States on exactly that kind of course by aiming to remove Saddam, the cultural biases within the US military prevented it from understanding, or at least accepting, what that mission was, in reality, likely to be. This led to a campaign plan that focused almost completely on defeating Iraq's Republican Guard and putting military pressure on Baghdad until the regime collapsed from within. transitioning the administration of the country to the 2-month-old Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance and an expatriate-led Iraqi interim government was almost an afterthought. This plan largely discounted Saddam Hussein's extensive paramilitary apparatus, tribal patronage system, and intra-Iraqi ethno-religious dynamics, all of which would play crucial roles in the ensuing instability and insurgency. This cultural proclivity to prioritize conventional military formations and discount paramilitary and other non-conventional forces also extended to military intelligence. Not only did 5th Corps and 3rd Army headquarters fail to appropriately understand the nature of the paramilitary forces they were facing during the invasion, focusing instead on conventional formations such as Republican Guard divisions, which had, by that time, almost become a secondary element of Saddam's wider military. But for months into the insurgency, they continued to view enemy forces in terms of typical Soviet-style military formations with strict hierarchies and sizes. Furthermore, US intelligence simply failed to understand the importance of Iraq's complex ethno-religious, cultural, and social dynamics, resulting in both flawed assessments of Iraqi military capabilities, especially its non-conventional forces, and inaccurate assumptions on how Iraq's ethnic and sectarian factions, tribes, and the wider security apparatus would respond to the removal of the Baath regime. Finally, Coalition Command writ large, including CENTCOM, Coalition Forces Land Component Command, and 5th Corps Headquarters, fixated on the demands of the conventional phase of the campaign and assuming that it would have the support of the Iraqi army, did not make any realistic plans for securing the whole of Iraq with its small ground force footprint alone. As the US official history concludes, it was due to these factors that, although the invasion was a brilliant operational victory, it was, in fact, a strategic failure. What the coalition had intended to be a surgical regime change quickly deteriorated into a general collapse of the Iraqi state, a process accelerated by the myopic policies implemented by the CPA, creating a power vacuum and a breakdown of law and order. In the absence of any authority that could govern or maintain order, including the comparatively small coalition military forces, Iraqis looted public assets and carried out reprisal attacks against their former Baathist masters. Coalition formations did not anticipate these developments and spent weeks reacting to the growing instability instead of preparing to orderly transition to an interim civil authority. Although the coalition military eventually regained some measure of control in many urban areas, the damage was done. Average Iraqis who had expected the coalition to re-establish order quickly and improve standards of living became disillusioned as the essentials of the Iraqi state evaporated, and Iraq's social order began to break down. In the midst of this turmoil, Generals McKinnon and Wallace established unit boundaries that made operational sense, but were often misaligned with Iraq's physical and ethno-religious terrain. Given their severely limited resources, the generals also decided to make Anbar and the Shia provinces economy of force missions. After the Marines and the 3rd Infantry Division were withdrawn from Iraq in the summer of 2003, these two critical regions were left to a small US Army contingent and a polyglot multinational force respectively, neither of which had sufficient combat power to secure the territory and contain the unrest there. In addition to the withdrawal of some of the coalition's most capable units, the force as a whole endured a sustained period of command turnover. Lieutenant General J. Garner's Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance was summarily replaced by the even less resourced and experienced Coalition Provisional Authority under Ambassador Bremer. At Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld's insistence, the Coalition Forces Land Component Command that had just conducted the invasion returned to Kuwait, leaving the tactical 5th Corps headquarters to transform overnight into a theatre command responsible for the entire country, a headquarters led by the Army's most junior Lieutenant General. At the same time, institutionally driven changes of command and mandatory military moves left some units like the 1st Armoured Division with entirely new leadership. When superimposed on the hastily assembled new Iraqi Governing Council, this turnover of key personnel and organizations effectively put a combination of novices and opportunists in charge of Iraq, with neither the expertise nor the resources needed to replace the collapsed Iraqi state. Meanwhile, the Coalition Provisional Authority, CENTCOM, and Combined Joint Task Force 7 began moving forward with a new campaign to internationalize the Iraq War and stand up new Iraqi security forces, with the goal of allowing the United States to reduce its footprint in Iraq dramatically to fewer than 30,000 troops by the end of 2004. Even without the dramatic influence of Zarqawi, the coalition never had the resources to achieve this ambitious plan. In any case, Rumsfeld and the institutional army were reluctant to provide any additional forces, the former for political reasons, the latter because it wished to continue with a significant modernization program, specifically the transition to the striker brigade combat team structure. The coalition's failure to understand the socio-cultural and religious environment in Iraq had far-reaching consequences that likewise thwarted CENTCOM's ambitious stabilization campaign. The disastrous CPA Orders 1 and 2 completely undermined the plan by effectively removing the Iraqi civil servants and military personnel that CENTCOM had intended to use for stabilization and reconstruction operations, not to mention fostering an insurgency that degraded that campaign further. The official history eruditely concludes. It is now clear that these worsening problems of insecurity, insurgency, and political instability were symptoms of two larger and more fundamental problems: state collapse and civil war. Virtually all of the issues that the coalition had to face in the second half of 2003 were the relatively predictable consequences of the collapse of the Iraqi state, a process which unfolded in patterns similar to other cases of state collapse witnessed in Somalia, the Balkans, Haiti, and even Afghanistan. The behavior of the Iraqi people in 2003 reflected the unsettling disappearance of a centralized and authoritarian state that had, for 4 decades, become the dominant force in almost all aspects of Iraqi society, atomizing most other institutions and leaving no civil society buffer between the individual and the state. When the Ba'ath collapsed and chaos ensued in order to simply survive, nearly 30 million Iraqis began to revert to long dormant sectarian, tribal, and ethnic identities. Above all, however, the developments of 2003 indicated that, in invading Iraq, collapsing the Iraqi state and leaving a power vacuum, the US-led coalition had unleashed a civil war between the many Iraqi factions, and in doing so created a maelstrom in which the regional powers were compelled to intervene to both promote their proxies and expand or secure their interests. With that reality clearly in view, it is now clear that many of the steps the coalition took to try and snuff out the budding insurgency and terrorist groups were doomed to failure, and may have even been counterproductive, at least in the absence of a larger program of political stabilization. Aggressive security operations to stop insurgents and terrorist groups against the backdrop of a vast power struggle in the country served, in many cases, only to drive the population towards extremist groups in both the Sunni and Shia communities. To some extent, these security operations were a red herring, distracting the coalition from the larger problems of a security vacuum and a failure of governance, neither of which became the coalition's main focus until 2007. At the same time, the US decision in late 2003 to move quickly towards Iraqi self-governance and an accelerated election timeline with the aim of stabilizing the country and eliminating popular support for the insurgency would actually have the opposite effect. The election only heightened the stakes in the violent struggle for power, inflamed divisions, and created a political process that could only be destabilizing in the midst of civil and regional war. These facts, however, would wait for years for the coalition to recognize and act upon them. In the meantime, Iraqis and the coalition together would descend into large-scale insurgency and pass through the fire of a brutal, sectarian civil war. Furthermore, for the long-suffering people of Iraq, who had, for 40 years, endured the horrors of a Baathist authoritarian dictatorship, a truly harrowing war with Iran, and a decade of sanctions-induced economic deprivation, the worst was, indeed, yet to come.